Lady Bluebell. They say things change when you observe them. For example, my mom would look so proud at my childhood soccer games, but she'd immediately change the moment she noticed me on the substitute bench. A moment of observation, intended or not, can change everything. One summer, my parents drove me out to a nearby national park. They had a junior ranger club where kids were introduced to all manner of wildlife, knowledge, and survival trivia. I wasn't sure about it at first. It seemed like just another thing on a long list of nothings, but I gave it an honest shot. Along with a dozen other kids and the chemically positive ranger accompanying us, we had craft sessions, survival training, cave exploration, and all kinds of games. Unlike sports, it wasn't just about beating an opponent. This was about cooperation, to work together. Seeing us all work toward a common goal changed something in me, brought out something good. I enjoy that. Back in July of '98, all 12 junior rangers set out on a spotlight night walk along with our guide. We were to pack our own survival kit and make our way out to one of the ranger stations. There we'd unpack and be graded based on what we chose to bring. There was this excitement in the air. It was like a graduation of sorts. We were to become official wildlife stewards, they called it. They excitedly paired us up in a buddy system, 2 by 2, and we followed the trail. It was supposed to be uneventful. The man in charge, Ranger Dan, had done that walk every summer for the past 12 years. He was prepared for a lot of things, but nature had other plans that night. I remember him holding up a hand, silently asking us to stop and listen. There was this deep groaning noise off somewhere in the dark. I heard rustling bushes and cracking saplings. I saw 2 gleaming stones reflecting the shine of our flashlights, a black bear looking back at it. It really wasn't as bad as it sounds. The bear sniffed at Ranger Dan for a bit and wandered off. But to a group of 10-year-olds, it was like staring at death itself. My buddy panicked and bolted into the woods. We're not allowed to ever leave our buddy, so I did my best to keep up with him. I yelled at him to stop, but by the time he did, we've been separated from the rest of the group. I couldn't even see their flashlights anymore. Luckily, they used to have a system in place to help lost visitors navigate. They called it the Lady Bluebell system. All over the park, they'd wrap blue tape around the trees and tie a bell in the direction of the closest ranger station or trail. Even in the dark, you could hear a bell go off every now and then, and you could check the bell to get a direction. Spotting that blue tape immediately improved our odds of survival. We'd been taught that if all else fails, all we had to do was follow 3 simple rules. Stop, listen, look. Lady Bluebell takes you home. Those were the rules. That first moment when I realized we were lost was horrifying. I could barely breathe, like I was choking on the darkness. My buddy was having a panic attack, but I did what I'd been told to do, to stop, listen, look. Lady Bluebell would take me home, and I swear, not only did I hear that bell, I saw her. A tall woman in a blue dress off in the distance, a suntanned arm pointing us in the direction of the trail, long dark hair framing a brilliant smile, a warm presence in the dark of night. Maybe I remember it wrong. Maybe she wasn't really there, but I think she was. My buddy and I were probably lost for no more than 20 minutes. We made our way back to the trail. Not long after that, we spotted flashlights in the distance. The rest of the night was nothing but praise from Ranger Dan, all the hot dogs we could eat, and scary stories told by a roaring campfire. I never told anyone about seeing Lady Bluebell. Not a living soul. My mom thought that night would be the end of my interest in the Junior Ranger Club. That did scare me away, but strangely, it had the opposite effect. I had used what I'd learned to survive to win. And this wasn't just a winning game. This was winning at life itself. I'd faced real, actual danger and lived to tell the tale. That's when I knew I wanted to be a park ranger. I got my Bachelor of Science in Forest and Natural Resource Management from MSU, worked a few different jobs, took a sabbatical, and ended up with a position at the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources in 2009. Nowadays, I'm the one running the Junior Ranger Club. Ranger Dan retired back in 2018, but still volunteers for the club in the summer. I've acquainted myself with the area for over a decade. I'm confident when I say I know my way around. I know what animals roam which areas, and I can tell by the shifting seasons what is to come. I know how flash floods smell, and I can tell by the taste of the air when a lightning storm is coming. Still, every now and then, Mother Nature surprises me, and sometimes she gives way to something different entirely. And the park has changed a lot too. The Lady Bluebell program, for example, over the years, it evolved into a sort of mascot. She was portrayed as this radiant woman in a blue summer dress. She also had her sidekicks, like the mischievous Ricky Raccoon, and the ever-somber Sunny the sad sunflower. They were in comic books, trading cards, stamps, merchandise. She was a beloved icon. They hired a woman to dress like her every summer to welcome the Junior Rangers and teach them the system. Lady Bluebell was sort of our Smokey the Bear, telling kids how to behave in the park to keep themselves and others safe. I loved it. Long after the Junior Ranger Club came to an end, I still collected all sorts of Lady Bluebell memorabilia. But there were issues over time. Some visitors to the park began stealing the blue tape, keeping it as a souvenir. Others just took the bell. Some moved the bell around purposefully, pointing it in the wrong direction. Over time, the effort and resources required to constantly fix the system started to outweigh the benefits. They officially ditched the Lady Bluebell Takes You Home motto in 2008 and retired the mascot entirely in 2011. I was sad to see her go, but it made sense. It just wasn't practical anymore. Times change. Now that you know me a little better, I want to tell you about one particular incident, something I haven't been able to share with my friends and colleagues. It was late August. I was following our southeasternmost trail, mapping the movements of an allard. The leaves were just about to change color, and there was a tinge of cold in the air. Branches had started making snappier sounds, and the days were rapidly growing shorter. Autumn was just around the corner. That day, I was ready to head back when I spotted a plume of smoke just off my trail. Nothing big, possibly a campfire. I decided to give it a once-over just in case. I came upon a small camp, a roughly-looking one-man tent, neon orange, a hastily constructed campfire, with what looked like a grilled squirrel. I caught a whiff of sweat coming off the tent, giving me the impression that whoever lived there had been around for a while. Looking at their choice of meal, I figured maybe a bit too long. "Hello, hello," I called out. "Anyone here?" I heard a shout in response and hurried footsteps, someone falling, getting up, and then sprinting in my direction. At first, I was taken aback, thinking it might be a wild animal. Seconds later, a young woman crawled into camp. The best word to describe her was disheveled. Her hair was a tangled mess, and she was deeply sunburnt on her arms and face. Her lips were dry and pale, and her hands kept shaking. The moment she saw me, her eyes welled up with tears. "Yes," she cried. "Jesus Christ." Yes, she got up and flung her arms around me, crying onto my shoulder, not just a sob, either, but a full-on wail. She tried to say something, but every other word got stuck in her throat. "Did I make it?" She sniffled. "Am I out?" I sat her down, offered her some water, and asked her to calmly explain what had happened. I can't believe my luck," she said. "I thought I was all over." I choked on my words. Nothing had prepared me for this. We weren't out looking for anyone. We hadn't been for months, maybe years. "It's okay," I said. "Let's pack you up. Let's get you home." We got back on the trail and started making our way back. I took up my radio to call it in. I used to come out here all the time. "Anya," she said, "never thought I'd get lost. It happens to the best of us." I smiled. "You made it. That's what counts." I thought I did right. I stopped, listened, and looked. Follow the bells. All of it. We don't do that anymore. I figured I told Anya about how the Lady Bluebell program had been discontinued for over a decade. I complained about the sabotaged bells, the stolen tape, and all the stupid things that tourists had done over the years. Frankly, I found it strange she found any bells at all. I hadn't seen them for years, but there were more immediate concerns. I'd never had trouble with my radio before, but now it was dead as a doornail. I brought out my backup batteries, but the radio stayed silent. Still, Anna was in better shape than I'd anticipated, so I figured we'd make it back by nightfall if we kept a good pace, about 200 feet down the trail. Something started to feel wrong. The trail should have turned by then, heading west instead. It kept going north. Looking around, I couldn't see any of the usual landmarks. We continued for another 10 minutes, only to see the trail suddenly stop. Not slowly disappear into the moss, but stop altogether. There were no trails like that. Not on that hike, not for as long as I'd been there. I wasn't taking any chances, and there was no point in dwelling on it. The radio was busted, so I picked up my flare gun. It was only one shot, so I had to make a count. I aimed it up, asked Anya to step back, and fired. The light soared into the sky with a whoosh, bathing the treetops in an intense red glow. Those things are louder than you think. It's nothing like the movies. Now, we sit tight. I said, they can't find us if we keep moving, so we buddy up. Anya smiled. That's what you're supposed to do, right? That's right. I nodded. You a junior ranger. Anya made herself comfortable on a log and took a swig from my canteen. Lady Bluebill takes you home, she sighed. She shook her head and handed back my canteen. A twinkle in her eye came and went. Not anymore. It seemed we stayed out there for hours. We shared a protein bar, and Anna helped me set up a campfire to my surprise. There was a stream nearby. There wasn't supposed to be, but there was. We boiled some water, refilled my canteen, and made ourselves comfortable. It could be hours before someone got to us. It didn't take long for the sky to turn black. I figured no one would find us in the dark, so we set up camp. Anya had her tent, and I had a hammock. We both went to bed early, but I couldn't get any sleep. My new buddy was out cold, though. I guess the excitement of seeing another person for the first time in weeks was enough to wear her out. I, on the other hand, was anxious about not finding my way back. It didn't make any sense. I'd walked that trail 1,000 times. Somewhere in the space between the waking world and an uneasy sleep, I remember thinking about Lady Bluebell. Her 3 rules were simple. Stop, listen, look. First, to stop so you don't get more lost than you already are. Second, to listen. The sound of the bells usually travels much further than the sight of the blue tape. And the third rule, to look, was a reminder to identify which way the bells were positioned. I remember thinking that we'd already done the first part. We'd stopped. A part of me wanted to listen, like I did back when I was a kid, to hear that bell and find my way back. As sleep faded from my mind, my eyes drifted into the dark. I noticed a strip of blue tape wrapped around a nearby tree. Strange that I hadn't seen it before. Maybe it wasn't there until I started to look for it. Anya was awake long before I was. She heated a bag of chickpeas from my pack and sliced up some salami. Simple stuff, but all you needed to keep going. I went to refill the water canteen again, but couldn't find my way back to the stream. Realizing it just wasn't there anymore made my blood run cold. I wasn't used to doubting myself. I knew these woods like the back of my hand, and suddenly it felt like I'd found an extra finger. None of this made any sense. I checked my map and double-checked my compass. There was nothing even close to a landmark in our vicinity. No obvious elevations, lakes, or rivers. I was running out of options. It took me a moment to realize that Anya was staring at me from across the campfire. Having picked up on my anxious fiddling, she gave me a reassuring smile. "I saw her," she said. Anya interrupted. That's new." We came to the same conclusion. We weren't alone out there. We continued north, but I couldn't help the feeling that there was something off about the whole area. I started to notice little details all around. broken branches and paths in the grass. There was a spot next to a large rock that looked like someone had been sleeping next to it. The tracks were pretty distinct. I even found a few footprints, and Anya swore that she'd never been there before. By late afternoon, I was getting worried. Not only had there been more footprints and tracks, but they were getting fresher. We slowed our pace, and I started to take a better look around. I needed to get an estimate of just how many others were out there. I was following the tracks of about 3 people when I saw another clearing ahead of us. It took me a few moments to realize that we had effectively walked in a circle. We were back at square one. I could even see the stop, listen, look sign in the distance. I brought out my compass, took Anya by the arm, and stormed off. We had to try again. I don't know when and where we got turned around, but we couldn't stop now. We kept going north, and this time I didn't put away my compass for a second. We settled into a steady jog, making sure the clearing stayed behind us. Anya kept a steady pace, even if she made a lot of noise. At one point, we stopped to drink some water. I looked back for a second. I want to see something in the distance. I couldn't tell what it was, but it was standing upright. No, not just standing, running. At first, we didn't understand what we were looking at. It took me several seconds to realize it was even human. A young man, no older than 17, maybe 18. Rough hair with cuts all over his legs and arms. He was only wearing a pair of torn jeans, darkened by weeks of built-up dirt. He didn't run like people usually do. He was hunched over and flailing with his arms. He kept doing this strange motion with his neck, like a bobblehead, never standing still. As he got closer, I could hear this constant mumbling. Not a scream or a whisper. It was like he was trying to manically force little words into every exhaled breath. I couldn't hear what he was saying. I only understood that it was repeating, "Don't stop, don't stop, don't listen." His eyes locked onto mine. His pupils widened as a shiver worked its way into his voice, shaking his head. Don't look." He quivered, don't look." His eyes flicked to something off my side. A piece of tape hanging off a broken tree. As I tried to assess his wound, he burst into movement, no longer able to run straight. He toppled over into a bent-over gallop, bracing himself against trees and stumps as he fled in a panic. I heard branches snapping long after he was out of sight. Anya just stood there, frozen. I tried to put my hand on her shoulder, but she reflexively slapped it away. I could see she was on the verge of hyperventilating, barely holding on. Just give me a second, please." After that, we slowed down. I kept hearing noises in the distance, mumbled words and snapping twigs. Sometimes, when there was a gust of wind, there'd be bells, sometimes one, sometimes several. But we stayed on course, moving north. As night fell, I realized that I didn't want to stop. Whenever I stopped, the sounds would get louder, the bells would get closer. Whatever lurked in the dark seemed to gain on us. Even though nothing leaped out at us, and there were no more attacks, I had this constant sense of unease, like sleeping in gasoline right next to a wobbly candle. Anya wasn't feeling much better, but she sat next to our campfire for hours, slowly rocking back and forth. Sometimes I'd see her snapping her head in one direction or the other, as if reacting to a sudden noise that only she could hear. I twisted and turned for hours, barely keeping my eyes shut. It felt like the night would never end. The more I thought about it, the slower time seemed to move. I remember staring up at the night sky, waiting for the moon to come into view. It never did. Anya told me she would wake me up before going to sleep so we could take turns keeping watch. It didn't do me much good, though. I was just as awake as she was. I got about an hour's worth of sleep. All in all, Anya didn't get anything. She didn't even bother to set up her tent when I finally got up. It was still dark out. I checked my wristwatch, but it stopped just before midnight. Anya was still up, staring into the cinders of the campfire. We had plenty of firewood, but she just couldn't be bothered to put them on. I figured that there was nothing to worry about, But something in the back of my mind kept telling me otherwise. I can't let her take me, I thought. Anya wheezed. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Before I got the chance to process what she'd done, a sound cut through the forest breeze. Bells. So many bells. I turned to see the broken woman towering over me. She was so much taller than expected. My legs buckled as I looked up at no less than a 9-foot-tall monstrosity. Her torn blue dress was lined with bells that chimed against every branch and roof she passed over. She wasn't going to let me leave. She refused to be forgotten. I shouldn't have stopped or listened or looked. I stepped back, and she stepped forward. Her feet barely touched the ground, floating inches above the moss. Her ivory eyes burrowed into me, shrieking with desperation. She wouldn't let me go. She couldn't. I turned to flee. I ran and jumped and crawled, forcing myself past every obstacle. I snagged my foot on fallen rocks. I tumbled down a sudden slope, dropping half my gear. I stepped through a shallow mud, drenched myself in cold water, all the way to my knees. I bled my hands, feet, and face, but I kept going. Somewhere along the way, the sun rose. Wheezing for air, I realized I couldn't hear the bells anymore. But the moment I stopped to listen for them, I heard one. No, stop, I yelled out loud. I shouldn't listen, I shouldn't stop either. I had to keep going. It all reminded me of what my teachers had said years ago, how the world changes when we observe it. Maybe if it wasn't for people coming to listen and look, there would be nothing to see there. Maybe by keeping people around, a part of her collective self remains. I don't know how long I was out there. At least a couple of days. I kept moving, stopping only for short bursts of rest. Sometimes I dreamed of bells and would wake to hear them. The slightest thought of Lady Bluebell drew her to me like a moth to an open flame. I'd hear the bells long before I saw her, but one would always accompany the other. She was always there, a stray thought away. I survived by eating boiled pine cones, roots, and eggs from warbler nests. I tried to track my progress, but there was no way to navigate. I'd either end up where I came from or going in the wrong direction. I saw that same sign in that same clearing at least a dozen times. Don't stop, don't listen, don't look. My feet chafed, and I'd grown a solid layer of beer from the stubble. Having barely slept, I was having trouble shaping cohesive thoughts. I remember sitting by a stream, not knowing how I got there. Maybe the same stream I'd seen that first day of meeting Anna. I was wringing up my socks and trying my best to ignore my shivering hands. I felt so weak that I couldn't remember what strength felt like. Just getting back on my feet felt like such a monumental task. I couldn't force myself to do it. I resigned myself to sitting there with one naked foot in the ice-cold water. My skin color faded as my blood pulled from a painful purple to a sickly blue. It took me a few moments to realize I wasn't alone. But it wasn't Lady Bluebell. It was Anna, just across the stream. She looked at me with this air of pity, apologetically. It took me a few seconds to notice the makeshift spear she'd whipped up using the Swiss Army knife from my pack. No doubt, I really am sorry, she said. After she feeds, she calms down. When she's calm, you can get out. I had to bring someone new in. The others are too fast, too clever. I couldn't bring myself to curse or scream. I just hated Anya, and what she turned me into. I kept my eyes on the stream, watching the water turn my foot a new tint of blue. Just take a nap, she said. Lean back and let it happen. No fuss, no drama. I barely listened. All I could think of was that tinge of blue forming at the edge of my toe. It made me think of her. It made me think of bells. It made me look for her. That's it, said Anna, readying her spear. I'll just give you a little tap to make sure we won't have any problems. I looked down at my hands covered in scabs and bruises, my wet socks clinging to my thigh. Suddenly, a pain shot through my left leg, a quick jab from her spear, and my body exploded with damaged nerves. It was as if a burst of electricity shot through me, forcing me out of my lethargy. As my blood mixed with the stream, I could feel my heart beating out of my chest. I crawled backward, unable to put any weight on my leg. Anya backed away, staying just close enough to make sure Lady Bluebell was properly fed. The lady was already there. Maybe I had listened too long or looked too hard. Maybe it was just the blue tint of my toe. Whatever it was, my thoughts had drawn her to me. And this time, I couldn't run. I heard the bells dragging my way and saw a long shadow cover the ground. I looked back for a moment, catching a glimpse of her dead eyes coming my way. Lady Bluebell doesn't take you home anymore. I couldn't run, but I had to try something. Anything. I tied my wet socks together into a makeshift blindfold and put it on as tight as I could. I pushed my wet fingers into my ears and screamed. I figured that if I couldn't listen or look, maybe she'd be less interested in feeding on me. I focused on the pain in my leg as hard as I could, letting it envelop my thoughts. I knew she was closing in. My pulse went haywire, begging me to panic, to look back, to listen for threats, and to run, to know, to expect, and to prepare myself. But I didn't. There was the soft touch of a cloth against my head, little pieces of metal bells dragged across my body as Lady Bluebell passed me by. She didn't care for someone who couldn't look or listen, but Anya could. Anya did, keeping the sock blindfold on. I flopped to my belly, kept my fingers in my ears, screaming until my throat was raw. I felt a thumping on the ground as something was dropped and heard quick footsteps in rapid succession. Someone was running. Then a sudden stop for what felt like an eternity. It was just me and my thoughts. Maybe she got away. Maybe we both made it. Then something meaty bumped into me, something warm and wet. It splattered onto my clothes and stained my face, drowning the air with a stench of blood. There was a reverberation in the air, like the vibration of a scream, but I didn't turn to look. I didn't turn to listen, and I refused to stop. Hours later, I made myself a crutch. I pressed wet moss into my ears and kept the blindfold on, deaf and blind. I forced myself forward. It was just inches at a time, and every step of the way shot through me like a bolt of lightning. Somewhere along the way, I felt a solid trail under my feet, taking off the blindfold. I started to notice familiar landmarks. My clock started ticking, and my radio burst to life. I was back on familiar ground. Maybe Anna had been right. Lady Bluebell was more relaxed after a feeding. Civilization was just around the corner, waiting for me to observe it once again. I'd been gone for 6 weeks. It was none other than Ranger Dan who came across me, leading a troop of junior rangers across the same trails as all those years ago. And yes, he had hot dogs. Now that some time has passed and my leg is healed, I've retreated to an administrative position. I keep my exposure to the park minimal. I haven't told anyone about what really happened, not only because it sounds completely insane, but because knowing about it might actually put them in danger. I might not get along with everyone, but I wouldn't wish for anyone to come looking for Lady Bluebell. Anya Baker was indeed reported missing from a company retreat about 8 years prior. The strange young man was a mystery. No one matching his description had been seen for years. Looking back at it, it feels so obvious Anya had been so frantically preoccupied with fighting her way forward that she never really considered the very first rule, to just stop. Perhaps there is some greater lesson to be learned there. There were so many of us that never wanted Lady Bluebell to leave. We stopped along the trails to listen and look, hoping some part of her was still out there. Maybe we were just looking for our childhoods. I know I was. I believe that she was some collective consciousness of belief remaining in a forgotten part of what the park used to look like, a creature we all made and abandoned, like the ghost of someone who never truly was. Maybe the world changes when we look at it, and sometimes it changes when we don't. And in the deep dark of those unseen chasms, things still grow, unheard, unseen, and unstoppable. Archway in the woods. I always wanted to be a park ranger for as long as I can remember. Being out in nature, hiking, camping, and fishing. It's pretty much all I wanted to do as a kid. Once I realized that profession existed, that was my only career pursuit. I trained for it like an astronaut going to outer space, reading up on all the necessary qualifications. I learned that it was a pretty daunting undertaking in a lot of ways. To be a park ranger, you need to be an expert outdoorsman, physically strong, and have good endurance. You need to be confident with firearms if you're working in an area with bears and cougars, and you need to have first aid training and a range of other certifications. But those hurdles didn't stop me. They inspired me. Throughout my late teens and early 20s, I had a corkboard on my bedroom wall with every park ranger requirement listed on it, flanked by photos of my favorite national parks. I checked the qualifications off one by one, celebrating as I achieved them. Living at home with my parents, I saved up every penny I earned with the goal of going to school for conservation enforcement, one of a few programs geared towards people in my aspiring line of work. Eventually, I got my diploma from a nearby community college, which was about all I could afford. It took a while, and I worked a lot of odd jobs, but eventually, I was hired full-time by the Forestry Service as a fire lookout. This was after at least 30 rejected applications, and by that point, the recruiters probably knew my resume by heart without even reading it. I was thrilled, accepting the job over the phone with a cry of joy to which my boss laughed and said he was looking forward to meeting me. Throughout my on-the-job training, I picked things up quickly, and my supervisor, Ross, said I was a natural. It wasn't long before he was sending me out alone to clear brush or do simple tasks. Despite the fact that he was supposed to be shadowing me all the time, he said he trusted me and that it took a lot to gain his trust. On my last day of training at Fire Tower 14, we were sitting in the cabin playing chess when Russ noticed something in the distance, a bit of smoke rising up out of the trees. It was just a wisp of white smoke, indicative of a campfire. "We should probably go check that out," Ross said, handing the binoculars to me and pointing. I saw it immediately and nodded, thinking it would be nice to get out and do something different. The routine of clearing brush and taking out trash, reading books, and playing board games and cards was getting monotonous. It was late afternoon, and there were still several hours of sunlight left. I grabbed my backpack and rifle, filled my canteen with water, and was about to set out when Ross muttered something over my shoulder. "Son of a beach," he said a little louder this time. It wasn't like him to curse, and I was a little surprised to hear him do it. Ross had always reminded me of a Boy Scout in a man's body. His enthusiasm for the job was infectious, and he was always in a good mood. "What?" I asked, walking over to him. "It's another one. Nobody bothers getting a camping permit anymore these days." He pointed to another fire burning in the distance, this one a little closer. Normally, we wouldn't go out to bother campers, but these were not registered camping sites, and people like that often didn't bother to clean up after themselves, and sometimes got injured out in the woods since they weren't prepared. Most people who care enough to go camping properly will actually acquire a camping permit. They know it isn't worth the risk of being fined. These people clearly didn't care. "You know what?" Ross said, looking at me. "This is actually perfect. It's your last day of training, which means next time something like this happens, you're going to be on your own. Nobody around for miles. So let's split up the two offenders, and we'll each take one. I'll be in radio contact with you the whole time." They look like they're only a couple of miles away from each other. How's that sound? Despite the fact that I'd been eager for the job my entire life, now that I was faced with the prospect of doing it alone, I was a little nervous, but I nodded my head, agreeing with his plan. "All right, let's do it," I said, just like we practiced. He told me as we began to climb down the stairs from the tower, "Don't get into any confrontations. If they want to argue, you walk away. You call me for backup. Otherwise, just leave them the citation. Move on. Tell them to find a new campsite, or we'll come back to confiscate their gear. You know, the usual routine." The two of us took the Jeep, which was parked at the base of the tower, and drove down the dirt trail until we saw the first vehicle pulled over at the side of the road. It was empty with no one inside. "Okay, you take this one. Radio me once you make contact. Remember, don't take any unnecessary risks. If anything doesn't seem right, just let me know." Ross looked very nervous all of a sudden, making me more worried than I had been a second before. He looked like he was going to say something else, and opened his mouth as if he were about to do so, but then shook his head as if telling himself not to. After a few seconds of awkwardness, I reassured him I'd radio him once I made contact. He told me to get going and stay safe. Driving off, once I'd shut the passenger door of the Jeep, I was left alone, surrounded by wilderness. Taking a deep breath and letting it out, I began to march into the trees towards the smell of campfire smoke in the distance. The brush was thick, since there was no real trail here, but I could see where the campers had dragged their cooler through the shrubbery and could make out their boot prints in the mud. If I had to make a guess, there were at least 3 or 4 of them. It didn't take long before I came across a clearing, and standing in the middle of it was a large stone archway. The human-made structure was about a 10-minute walk from the road and looked like a bridge constructed for a railroad to pass over it. But it made no sense for it to be way out here in the middle of the forest, away from any civilization, and far away from any active railroads. A dirt path emerged from nowhere, leading towards this arch and going underneath it to the other side, seeming to beckon me. I didn't know the area well enough to say that this was completely out of the ordinary, but to my eyes, it did look unusual. Ross hadn't mentioned any decommissioned railroads passing through this part of the forest, but then again, it could have been long out of use. As I approached the stone archway, I got a queasy rising feeling in my stomach, like when you're a kid in the backseat of a car, and your parents are driving down a hilly dirt road, and you go over a steep hill too fast. On the opposite side, looking through the archway, I saw the sky was a bruised shade of purple. On the other side, black clouds floated along in stark contrast to the clear blue sky, which I'd seen from the watchtower. I looked over my shoulder, and the sky was blue. I looked straight ahead again, and saw it was that surreal purple shade, but only on this side of the archway. "What the hell?" I muttered to myself. Walking through the stone archway to the other side, the moment that I did, my body broke out in pins and needles as if every limb had fallen asleep for just a second, but then the sensation passed. I felt as if I had crossed over some threshold into another world, but I convinced myself I was just being foolish, letting my adrenaline get to me. This was simply a new and scary experience, being alone by myself out here, but I would need to get used to it fast. Steeling myself with a deep breath, I squared my shoulders and continued marching forward. The forest was still the same, but the sky was that dark purple shade, and I didn't understand why it would look like that. It was still a few hours until sunset, so it wasn't being caused by the sun's approach towards the horizon. There was something else. A forest fire, maybe. "Ross, come in," I said into my radio, which was clipped to my uniform shirt. There was a burst of static, but nothing came after that. "Ross, status update," I said again. There was nothing. "Great," I said. "Some backup." "You air." The forest swallowed me up again as I walked along the path until it disappeared. Strangely, the woods were difficult to traverse in this section. Huge trees blocked my path, their low branches impossible to get around. I had completely lost the camper's trail, and I was starting to worry I'd lost my bearings altogether. So I pulled out my compass to regain my trajectory. But when I looked down at the face of the compass, it didn't make sense. It wasn't pointing in any one direction. Instead, it spun around in lazy half and quarter circles, reversing and changing direction constantly. Then it began to spin in a maddening arc, faster and faster, going in circles until the glass broke and the needle flew off into the sky, completely unhammed from the device. I heard it whiz past my ear like a straight bullet. Okay, that was weird. I tried to comprehend what was happening. What could cause a compass to do that? A strong magnet. That's impossible, though all of this was impossible. I looked up at the sky and traced the bruised purple color, turning my head so I could see behind me. The violet shade now covered the sky entirely, including behind me where it had been bright blue just minutes before. What the hell is going on? I wondered. I turned around and started back. My heart was beating fast, my legs trembling and numb, feeling like blocks of wood attached at the waist. Had a nuclear bomb detonated somewhere? Was this the end of the world? Was that why the sky looked so strange now? I keyed the radio again, hoping I would get a response from Ross as I blundered through the forest. Feeling sick, felt like I was going to throw up. "Ross, come in." I practically screamed into the radio, but there was no answer. "I need to run." I picked up my pace. Was that archway? I thought to myself. I should have never gone through it. I could tell it was wrong. I could tell it was evil. A feeling of pins and needles, that rising sensation in my gut. Every part of my body had been trying to tell me not to go through the thing, but I hadn't listened. I heard stories before. I'd read tales on the internet of backrooms and hidden interdimensional portals that led to places like this that shouldn't exist. Dimensions locked away through space and time and other mechanisms we don't understand, which people stumble into and can't escape. Stairs that lead to nowhere but take a portion of your lifespan should you decide to climb them, causing you to vanish and disappear from your friends for untold lengths of time. Feelings of one missing in national parks all the time. There was no explanation for it, at least not until now. Pushing aside the brush, I made my way back into the forest, into the clearing where the archway had been. My heart sank as I stared at the blank spot where it had been. The stone archway was gone. I stood there for a while, just staring at the blank space where it previously stood, but it didn't change the fact that the thing had vanished. I spun around in circles, thinking maybe I'd lost my way and gone off track. Maybe this was all in my head, and I just lost track of time. That's why the sky was purple, and why I was having trouble finding my way back. I wasn't trapped in another dimension. I just spaced out, and the sun was setting. That was all it was, nothing more. I convinced myself this was true, even though part of me knew that it wasn't. If I kept walking in this direction, I told myself, I would hit the dirt road eventually. I was sure enough of my bearings to know that the road lay in this direction, and I could be simply walking back to Tower 14 from there. Once I found it, sure, Ross would be pissed. He would tell his bosses that I needed more training, but he would say that I wasn't ready yet. But that was okay. Maybe I wasn't. Maybe despite all the years of getting ready for this day, maybe I was still just an amateur with this new plane in mind. I kept walking straight back the way I'd come. I knew better than to push it when I'd already lost my bearings, not to mention my compass. The best bet was just to walk along back to the safety of the road. The longer I walked, though, the more I began to realize what I suspected deep down was true. The road was not there. Oh no, 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 I wondered to myself as my progress came to a halt. It's not here. The road should have been here, even if I was slightly off course. I should have seen it by now, but it was nowhere to be found. Worse than that, the sky was getting dimmer with those horrible black clouds covering it with patches of purple and filling them in with malignant darkness. "Ross, please come in," I yelled into the radio for what felt like the 100th time. A clap of thunder boomed overhead, sounding discordant and wrong to my ears. It was a bad imitation of thunder, a foggy artist still learning the ropes. As he shook at a giant sheet of tin like a rug on cleaning day, it warbled and shook the ground like the reverberations were lasting for far too long afterwards. And that was what did it. The sound of alien thunder brought me over the edge of certainty, and I knew for sure in that moment what I had suspected all along. This wasn't the national park. This wasn't even Earth anymore, at least not my Earth. I truly had slipped into another dimension through that gateway. Despite how mad it all sounded, I was on the other side of some multi-dimensional portal, and not only that, now the gateway was gone. I was trapped here. Turning around, I decided I needed to go back to the place where I found it. even if it was gone now. I would have to return eventually. That was my only hope. I couldn't stay in this place. I didn't belong here. And who knew what creatures might lurk in the forest like this after dark? Even in our world, there were wolves, cougars, coyotes, and bears. I started to think what version of predator might live unchecked in this universe without people around to keep their numbers down. As if the forest had read my mind, I heard a rustling sound to my right. The light was dimmer now, and it was difficult to see, but I thought I noticed something a ways off in the distance, ducking behind trees and hiding from view, following me through the dark forest. Was it a person? It kind of looked like one. "Hello," I called out, my voice breaking with fear. "Hello," I called back, sounding like a tape recording in my own voice, slightly sped up and slowed down halfway through the word. The thing paused momentarily as it ducked out from behind the trees, looking at me, measuring me, standing in plain view for the first time, as if letting itself be seen. My skin turned ice cold when I caught a full glimpse of it. It saw me, and that was for sure. It was following me. The dark humanoid shape had grayish-blue skin and at least 2 sets of arms. It walked on 2 legs and ducked behind each tree as it passed by so as not to be seen. Its face was shrouded in long black hair, which covered its visage like heavy curtains. It was completely naked and unclothed, its genitals covered by its long hair, carrying nothing with it. To my eyes, it looked like an animal, a creature more than a person. Although it walked on 2 legs and resembled a human, the extra set of arms was the most jarring aspect of it. It made it feel so much more like a nightmare, like this couldn't possibly be happening. My heart was pounding fast as I tripped over branches and fallen trees, stumbling and rising to my feet, and looking to see the thing was even closer now. It was on a diagonal path through the trees, pursuing me but also making its way closer and closer to me. For the first time, I saw its eyes through the tangled mask of hair that were reflective and gold like a cat in the night. Then I saw its teeth and its rancid, rotten smile. It rubbed its 4 hands together in a ball of moving flesh and fingers, like an excited old man about to eat his favorite meal. The creature knew I was scared, and it was enjoying itself, enjoying the hunt. Another twig snapped underfoot, and I first thought it was my own foot, which had done it since the sound was so close. But then I realized it was only a few feet away, which meant I spent a second just in time to see a face appear in front of me. At first, I thought it was another one of those things and almost took a wild swing at it, but then I saw the face was human. He was a man wearing a park ranger uniform. His hair was shoulder length and greasy, and he had a long beard which was untrimmed and scraggly. "Get behind me," he yelled suddenly, and as I did as he asked instinctively, hearing the sound of movement coming toward us through the brush from where the creature had been. The sound of the rifle's report was deafening. My ears were still ringing when he fired again. "That's my last bullet," he said, grabbing my arm and pointing to my feet. "I hope you brought some ammunition with you. Those things don't like to die." Noises could be heard behind us, and I realized that the creature was still in pursuit. Despite 2 well-placed rifle shots, Ross was compelled to follow the strange man as he raced ahead of me, looking back occasionally to see if I was still trailing him. I didn't have time to ask questions. I didn't have time to think about the fact that this archway was getting further and further away with each step. All I could do was run, and soon the sounds of more racing footsteps joined the first creature. There were several of them, and they were all hungry, moving in a pack like humanoid wolves. I only hoped this man knew where he was going, and that he had a plan to survive. My first week as a fire lookout stationed at Tower 14 had started off okay. All my life, I had wanted to be a park ranger, and now I was within 1 day of accomplishing my goal. After this final day of training, I was to be left on my own, but something catastrophic had happened, derailing all of those plans. After seeing 2 separate fires burning in the distance, my supervisor and I had set off in our Jeep to check out what we assumed were campfires. He left me alone to investigate one group of offenders while he approached the other campsite, and everything was going according to plan until I stumbled across a stone archway in the forest that looked very out of place. On the other side, the sky was purple, whereas on our side, it was blue. But I mistook that for the setting sun or some other phenomenon, and pressed onward. I wish I had trusted my instincts and stayed on the other side of the arch, because now I'm trapped in another world with no way home. The archway disappeared, leaving me stranded here, and I quickly realized I wasn't alone. There were creatures in the forest that looked like people but were not. They had an extra set of arms for one thing, and they called back to you if you spoke, but they were not human. Despite all odds, I'd been rescued by another park ranger right before getting mauled by the bizarre creatures. This man, who told me his name was David, said he had been trapped in this place for a month. He had a cave, which he managed to camouflage with tree branches, allowing us to hide from the creatures. After escaping from them, David knew a lot about this place, and he said the creatures avoided a certain part of the forest. So that was where he took me. He had set up traps which only he knew the placement of, and his hideout was there, stocked with provisions. A lot of plant life here is the same as in our world. He told me, when we arrived back at this camp, I found a patch of shiitake mushrooms, and I've been surviving off of those more or less. I had a few things in my bag. An energy bar, some trail mix. You know, the usual stuff. But I ran out of that pretty quickly. He showed me his little pile of foraged food, and I marveled at how well prepared he was. There were different species of mushrooms, some wild root vegetables, and some rowage he'd set aside to make a salad. "This is incredible," I said, and I thought I was a good survivalist. "You're still young," he told me. "I've been doing this sort of thing for a long time. I was in the British Special Air Forces when I was younger. They're highly trained soldiers, sort of like your special forces. Since I got across the pond, I've worked here and there, but most recently, I've been a fire lookout at Tower 14 for almost 10 years. I let out a soft gasp. That's where I'm stationed. You worked at Tower 14, he chuckled. Worked past tense. Damn, those bastards replaced me already. Well, I guess they must have given up looking for me too then. I thought back to that odd look Ross had given me when he was letting me out of the Jeep. He looked like he was going to say something, but maybe don't get killed or disappear like the last guy. It would have been too on the nose. Maybe he'd been thinking about how this was a bad idea. I realized maybe he was thinking we should go together, but instead, he'd let me go alone. I felt a twinge of anger, thinking about how none of this would have happened if Ross had been shadowing me like he was supposed to. "They're still looking for you," I said, not really knowing if that was true. "I'm sure they are. They wouldn't just forget about you." Ross didn't get around to telling me. "Yeah, that's all. I'm still in training." I didn't add that this was my last day of training, or that David's appearance seemed to have been purposely omitted from my orientation. David eyed me suspiciously, but didn't say another word about it. "I was going back out to look for more mushrooms when I spotted you. It's too dangerous to go out again tonight, but tomorrow we'll check for the archway again, and I'll show you the shake grove I go to. I act to that same spot every day and look for the arch." Can't believe I missed it. He was peeling a mushroom with his knife as he spoke. With that last sentence, he hurled the blade across the room, or it clanged against the rock wall, making a loud noise. "Quiet," I whispered, yelled at him. "I know you're upset, but we're going to get out of here." His face was emotionless as he looked back at me, tears welling up in his eyes. "That's what I've been telling myself for the last 36 days, he said. "I just hope to God you're right." As I tried to fall asleep that night, I couldn't. The idea of a man like David being brought to tears by this place was almost too much to bear. He was a killing machine, British Special Forces. He'd saved my life and pulled me out of a situation where I thought I'd be dead for sure. At least we had more ammunition now, 2 guns still. That didn't reassure me very much. Those creatures, whatever they were, did not like to die. I managed a few hours of offing on sleep before the sun came up, still appearing that same horrible shade of purple as it had the day before. It was starting to hurt my head. It felt just wrong being in this place, like we didn't belong here. Like the air was too thick and too heavy, not meant for me to breathe. Without even realizing it, I'd begun to hyperventilate. I tried to stop myself, to calm myself down, but was unable to. David came over and looked into my eyes, and after a while, I started to hear the words he was saying. The cave was still beginning to turn darker and darker all around me, but I could feel myself losing consciousness. I finally managed to listen to him breathe deeply. "Slow it down," he said. "That's okay. You're okay. I've lived here this long. The air is breathable. You're okay. Big boy. Big, deep breaths. Lad. Good boy. Okay, that's it. That's better. Keep breathing in and out." After a while, I started to calm down and looked at him gratefully, realizing the predicament I had been in. "Thanks," I said. "I needed that." "Stay there. Get your wits about you." "Got breakfast ready," he said, and I realized he had a portion of mushrooms and wild lettuce set aside for me. He brought it over on a flat rock and handed the food to me. "What's the plan?" I asked, eyeing the food suspiciously. Despite the fact that he said it was okay, I was still concerned. "Eat," he told me. "You need your energy. We're going to walk back over to the shitake patch. On the way, we'll check for the archway again, and I'll show you the shake grove. I go to that same spot every day and look for the archway," he said. "Can't believe I missed it." As he spoke with that last sentence, he hurled the blade across the room, or it clanged against the rock wall, making a loud noise. "Quiet," I whispered. Yelled at him. "I know you're upset, but we're going to get out of here." His face was emotionless as he looked back at me, tears welling up in his eyes. "That's what I've been telling myself for the last 36 days, he said. "I just hope to God you're right." As I tried to fall asleep that night, I couldn't. The idea of a man like David being brought to tears by this place was almost too much to bear. He was a killing machine. British Special Forces. He'd saved my life and pulled me out of a situation where I thought I'd be dead for sure. At least we had more ammunition now, 2 guns still. That didn't reassure me very much. Those creatures, whatever they were, did not like to die. I managed a few hours of offing on sleep before the sun came up, still appearing that same horrible shade of purple as it had the day before. It was starting to hurt my head. It felt just wrong being in this place, like we didn't belong here. Like the air was too thick and too heavy, not meant for me to breathe. Without even realizing it, I'd begun to hyperventilate. I tried to stop myself, to calm myself down, but was unable to. David came over and looked into my eyes, and after a while, I started to hear the words he was saying. The cave was still beginning to turn darker and darker all around me, but I could feel myself losing consciousness. I finally managed to listen to him breathe deeply. "Slow it down," he said. "That's okay. You're okay. I've lived here this long. The air is breathable. You're okay. Big boy. Big, deep breaths. Lad. Good boy. Okay, that's it. That's better. Keep breathing in and out." After a while, I started to calm down and looked at him gratefully, realizing the predicament I had been in. "Thanks," I said. "I needed that." "Stay there. Get your wits about you." "Got breakfast ready," he said, and I realized he had a portion of mushrooms and wild lettuce set aside for me. He brought it over on a flat rock and handed the food to me. "What's the plan?" I asked, eyeing the food suspiciously. Despite the fact that he said it was okay, I was still concerned. "Eat," he told me. "You need your energy. We're going to walk back over to the shitake patch. On the way, we'll check for the archway again, and I'll show you the shake grove. I go to that same spot every day and look for the arch. Can't believe I missed it." He was peeling a mushroom with his knife as he spoke. With that last sentence, he hurled the blade across the room, or it clanged against the rock wall, making a loud noise. "Quiet," I whispered, yelling at him. "I know you're upset, but we're going to get out of here." His face was emotionless as he looked back at me, tears welling up in his eyes. "That's what I've been telling myself for the last 36 days, he said. "I just hope to God you're right." As I tried to fall asleep that night, I couldn't. The idea of a man like David being brought to tears by this place was almost too much to bear. He was a killing machine. British Special Forces. He'd saved my life and pulled me out of a situation where I thought I'd be dead for sure. At least we had more ammunition now. 2 guns still. That didn't reassure me very much. Those creatures, whatever they were, did not like to die. I managed a few hours of off-and-on sleep before the sun came up, still appearing that same horrible shade of purple as it had the day before. It was starting to hurt my head. It felt just wrong being in this place, like we didn't belong here. Like the air was too thick and too heavy, not meant for me to breathe. Without even realizing it, I'd begun to hyperventilate. I tried to stop myself, to calm myself down, but was unable to. David came over and looked into my eyes, and after a while, I started to hear the words he was saying. The cave was still beginning to turn darker and darker all around me, but I could feel myself losing consciousness. I finally managed to listen to him breathe deeply. "Slow it down," he said. "That's okay. You're okay. I've lived here this long. The air is breathable. You're okay, big boy. Big, deep breaths, lad. Good boy. Okay, that's it. That's better. Keep breathing in and out." After a while, I started to calm down and looked at him gratefully, realizing the predicament I had been in. "Thanks," I said. "I needed that." "Stay there. Get your wits about you. Got breakfast ready," he said, and I realized he had a portion of mushrooms and wild lettuce set aside for me. He brought it over on a flat rock and handed the food to me. "What's the plan?" I asked, eyeing the food suspiciously. Despite the fact that he said it was okay, I was still concerned. "Eat," he told me. "You need your energy. We're going to walk back over to the shiitake patch. On the way, we'll check for the archway again, and I'll show you the shake grove. I go to that same spot every day and look for the arch. Can't believe I missed it," he continued, peeling a mushroom with his knife. With that last sentence, he hurled the blade across the room, or it clanged against the rock wall, making a loud noise. "Quiet," I whispered, yelling at him. "I know you're upset, but we're going to get out of here." His face was emotionless as he looked back at me, tears welling up in his eyes. "That's what I've been telling myself for the last 36 days, he said. "I just hope to God you're right." As I tried to fall asleep that night, I couldn't. The idea of a man like David being brought to tears by this place was almost too much to bear. He was a killing machine. British Special Forces. He'd saved my life and pulled me out of a situation where I thought I'd be dead for sure. At least we had more ammunition now. 2 guns still. That didn't reassure me very much. Those creatures, whatever they were, did not like to die. I managed a few hours of off-and-on sleep before the sun came up, still appearing that same horrible shade of purple as it had the day before. It was starting to hurt my head. It felt just wrong being in this place, like we didn't belong here. Like the air was too thick and too heavy, not meant for me to breathe. Without even realizing it, I'd begun to hyperventilate. I tried to stop myself, to calm myself down, but was unable to. David came over and looked into my eyes, and after a while, I started to hear the words he was saying. The cave was still beginning to turn darker and darker all around me, but I could feel myself losing consciousness. I finally managed to listen to him breathe deeply. "Slow it down," he said. "That's okay. You're okay. I've lived here this long. The air is breathable. You're okay, big boy. Big, deep breaths, lad. Good boy. Okay, that's it. That's better. Keep breathing in and out." After a while, I started to calm down and looked at him gratefully, realizing the predicament I had been in. "Thanks," I said. "I needed that." "Stay there. Get your wits about you. Got breakfast ready," he said, and I realized he had a portion of mushrooms and wild lettuce set aside for me. He brought it over on a flat rock and handed the food to me. "What's the plan?" I asked, eyeing the food suspiciously. Despite the fact that he said it was okay, I was still concerned. "Eat," he told me. "You need your energy. We're going to walk back over to the shite patch. On the way, we'll check for the archway again, and I'll show you the shake grove." We set up for the archway. The hike was a long one, and David brought plenty of water and provisions, filling up our canteen from a spring along the way. Once again, I felt glad for his guidance. If not for him, I'd probably be dead 10 times by now. After a long while, we reached the clearing where the arch had been. Once again, it wasn't there. The spot where it had been was empty, but he wandered over to it anyways. How can it just disappear? Be here one day and gone the next? I asked. David shook his head. How could any of this be possible? I wouldn't have believed it if someone told me. Would you? I thought about that for a few seconds. No, probably not. I think they were crazy or high, or maybe both. And yet, here we are, defying all rational common sense. There wasn't much more to say, so we continued walking. I tried desperately to ignore the feeling that I heard the sounds of rustling leaves behind us, as if someone were following quietly and at a distance. Every time I looked back, there was no one there. We reached the shite patch. David told me to start picking mushrooms quickly before the creatures found us. He said they were smart and would send out scouts, so once they knew where we were, more would be gathered, and they would come back to hunt us like pack animals. The worst part was they knew this was a favorite spot of his, so they would be ready for him. After a few short minutes of gathering mushrooms, David told me to wrap up. "Let's get going," he said. "There's no more time." Despite my fear, I couldn't believe what he was saying. We had just started. It had been such a long hike, and this small amount of mushrooms would barely sustain us for a day. "Come on, David. A few more minutes," I said. "Let's go." He hissed at me, his face morphing into one of rage. I almost didn't recognize him. His color changed, going red, almost purple, and there was something else strange too. His chest seemed to spasm when he was angry. The fabric puffed in and out in a very strange way, like he was breathing much too fast. He caught me looking at him and calmed down slightly, then came over to me and grabbed my arm, dragging me away from the mushroom patch. "I can see one. It's a little ways away. 6 o'clock, that means there's more. We need to start walking fast. Don't run. Don't look. Don't let them know we saw them all," he said while dragging me away from the mushroom patch. I fought the urge to glance over my shoulder, but I did hear the distinct sound of movement now coming closer, gaining on us steadily. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my heart pounding faster, my throat dry, my knees shaking. "Quiet," he whispered angrily. I was silent for a few short seconds, and the noises came closer, closer. "Run," he screamed, and I began to bolt as fast as I could through the trees. A second later, I heard them all around us. They had surrounded us. "Your gun," David screamed from behind me, and I tried to get ready while still running. Then I saw what he was worried about. One of the creatures was straight ahead, waiting for us, partially hidden behind a tree. It revealed itself, just barely poking its head out to look and see how far off we were. Then it disappeared again. "You see it?" he shouted. "Yeah, we get to that tree. You go left, I'll go right. Don't get too close." I understood immediately what he was doing. He was sacrificing himself for me by going to the right. He was running right through the eye line of the creature. He would be running right past it within inches of its grasp, all to distract it so it wouldn't get me. Part of me wanted to argue, but there was no time. We were already at the tree. I broke to the left, and David went right. The creature lunged at him just as I'd feared and managed to rake him with its long, talon-like fingernails. His back was bloodied as he ran, getting ahead of me as he put on speed. "There's more up ahead," he yelled, and I saw them a second later. There were at least two, maybe more, hiding in trees and waiting for us a little ways ahead. I had a feeling they would not be fooled as easily as the last one. We had a speed advantage on the creatures, at least the ones we come across so far, I thought. I hated to think what a faster version of these things would look like. Our ability to outrun them was the only thing keeping us alive. I can hear them chasing after us, their heavy footsteps loud as they crushed the leaves underfoot. "Let's split up," David said. "You go left, I'll go right. When we'd meet in the middle, say 100 PS from here." "Got it." I agreed, not sure what other options we had. I was deferring to him since he seemed to know what he was doing. Now he yelled, branching off from our trajectory, heading to the right at the same time I went left. The creatures took a moment to respond, but once they saw what we were doing, they left their hiding spots where they were waiting to ambush us. The creature closest to me came at me from my right, and I screamed as it came within a few feet of me. Its horrifying arms reached out to grab me. I felt the breeze from its hand rushing past, but managed to duck out of the way just in time, stumbling over a fallen log and face-planting right afterwards. The thing crawled after me, and I felt it grab my ankle, pulling me towards it as it screamed. Kicking as hard as I could with my other leg, I brought my foot up into the creature's jaw, were connected with a sickening crunch. It howled a hurt cry of anger as its grip loosened on my ankle. For a split second, I attempted to wrench myself free, but it held on tightly. The thing was so strong I was about to kick it again when I grabbed my other leg and began to crawl in towards my face. Its oversized eyes widened with anticipation, drool pouring out over its lower lip. The thing was about to eat me as it unhinged its jaw like a python about to consume a deer. I remembered my rifle slung across my back. The thing darted its head forward towards my neck, as if to start its meal with my jugular. The rifle was caught underneath my body weight. I was trying to rock side to side to pull it free while simultaneously shoving the thing away from me, with my knees kicking and bucking, and doing anything I could to whizzle my way out of its grasp. Just as its teeth were about to shut around my windpipe, I managed to free the rifle using all of my strength. I pulled my knees back and kicked the creature in its chest, sending it reeling backwards for half an instant. Just enough time for me to get shot off. The blast echoed through the forest, exploding outwards from the barrel of my rifle. One moment, the creature was there in front of me. The next, its head was gone, replaced by a bloody crater, jettisoning blood from the ruined remains of the creature's visage. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not looking back. After a long, harrowing run through the forest, I met up with David again. He looked even worse for wear than before. Whereas I had gotten away cleanly, he had been mauled by one of the creatures, just barely escaping with his life. He was bloodied and had gashes on his neck, his forehead, and both of his arms from defensive wounds. Worst of all, he lost his gun in the process, and now we were down to only one weapon for defense and half of the ammo. Eventually, we arrived back at the cave after a long run through the forest, barely escaping with our lives. David was in rough shape, and I helped him lay down on his bedroll. I went outside to find leaves or whatever possible to patch up his wounds. In the absence of bandages, I had a small first aid kit with me as well, which I brought everywhere, but it wasn't nearly enough for the injuries he'd sustained. I cleaned his wounds and packed the worst of them with gauze from my first aid kit, then wrapped them up with long leaves from the forest. David began pushing me away when I tried to bring his shirt to tend to the wounds on his back. I told him to calm down, but he wouldn't stop resisting me. Eventually, I relented and told him to deal with the cuts himself. They wouldn't heal properly if he didn't do something about them. But he just closed his eyes and drifted off to sleep, the blood running from his wounds leaking out onto the rock floor of the cavern while he snored. For the second night in a row, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about David and his injuries. He would be dead by morning if I didn't do something. There's too much blood loss. I couldn't understand why someone with his level of experience wasn't taking this seriously. Was he delirious? Suddenly, his snoring stopped. The cave was dead quiet and still in the darkness of the night, and then I heard a sound like rocks being moved. A shuffling of feet, bones creaking, cracking. There was a wet, sloppy sound, smacking lips and ripping flesh. Someone pulling meat from bone and tearing gristle with sharpened claws. I peered into the darkness of the cave, looking in the direction of the sound, and my eyes slowly began to adjust. David was up. He was eating something in the corner of the dark cave. It looked like, was it moving? Was that a rat or a squirrel? He took another bite of flesh from the creature he'd been moving in his grasp, and suddenly it was still again. The only sound was of him chewing. My eyes adjusted further, my heart pounding rapidly. David's shirt was off. He had treated his wounds after all. In the darkness, when I'd been trying to sleep, my eyes closed, and he had been busy dealing with his injuries. I realized now why he hadn't wanted me to see beneath his clothes. It all made sense. Suddenly, the twitching beneath his shirt when he got upset, the way his color changed when he was angry. His face had turned red, almost purple. Beneath his shirt was the most obvious change of all. He took another large bite of whatever it was he found scurrying in the cave, and with his 4 quickly moving hands, he pulled flesh from the bones and crammed more of the creature into his mouth. His eyes were golden and reflective when they caught me staring at him in the darkness, and as I got to my feet, I began to run. I stumbled out from the cave, terrified. My legs didn't seem to work properly. Everything around me was wrong. The colors, the shadows, the shapes of the trees, and the sounds of the singing birds sitting in their branches. This world was not my own, and I needed to get out now. Running as fast as I could through the forest, I remembered how I had come to be in this place as a park ranger trainee. I'd been on a fire lookout assignment and had been sent to confront a few campers who had made a bonfire without a permit in an off-limits area. But I had stumbled through a gateway to another world in the process, becoming lost in this strange place, trapped in another dimension with humanoid creatures with gray skin and forearms hunting people in the purple-tinged darkness. I fell flat on my face, landing hard after tripping over something, a vine. No, whatever it was thin and sharp, and it hurt me badly. The piano wire or whatever it was had cut across my shins, and I felt the warmth of blood trickling down from the skin. The traps I'd forgotten all about. The traps David had set all throughout this part of the forest to keep him safe from the creatures in this terrifying world. Come back. I heard David yelling over my shoulder from the darkness. It's not safe. You must come back. But I didn't listen. I scrambled back to my feet and began to run. My only thought was to get to the archway. The place where I'd entered this world. The portal back to Earth had to be there. It had to be. David's voice could be heard receding into the darkness behind me. I shuddered involuntarily, thinking about how I had seen him in the darkness of the cave, eating something like a rat or a mouse. Not only that, but his arms had been too many. There were an extra pair of hands working at the hairy flesh of the vermin he'd been eating, the bloody fur, and the tearing sounds of him ripping chunks from the creature's body with his teeth. I had too much to think about at first. I thought maybe he was lying to me from the beginning, and that he was from this place all along. Maybe he was born here and was trying to keep me trapped in this place. But the more I considered it, the more I realized that idea didn't sit right with me. David was not a denizen of this terrible violet-tinted world. No, he was from Earth. The way he spoke, talking about Fire Tower 14, which he said he had worked at, proved to me that he was not. From here, he was from Earth. My mind began to work out what this meant and came to the conclusion that being in this world changed you over time. Being here, eating the foraged food, and breathing the purple-tinged air, all of it was toxic to people from our world, and it caused side effects that were likely permanent. I only hoped I hadn't been here long enough for a change to occur in me. I shuddered at the thought of an extra pair of arms, splitting open the flesh of my abdomen and reaching out. grabbing anything they could get their hands on, hungry, desperate for food, for blood, for flesh, and the need to escape this nightmare. I need to get out of this place. Running through the woods more carefully now, I lifted my feet high off the ground to avoid tripwires and hoped that I didn't stumble into a trap-filled pit or some other death trap, which David had planted before being hired as a fire lookout. David had served in the British military in the SAS, a highly trained branch similar to the Special Forces in America. He was a deadly shot with a rifle, and I no longer had mine with me. I picked up my pace, hearing the sound of him coming after me through the forest. He was injured, and that would slow him down, but he also knew this place far better than I did. He knew where the traps were located and how to avoid them, whereas I was just hoping to be able to find my way back to the archway. The possibility of getting lost forever in the wilderness of this strange world occurred to me briefly, but I tried my best not to think about it, trying to remember the way we traveled through the forest. I stepped tentatively across the ground, no longer running but slowly walking through the trees now. I was terrified of stepping on a spike or tumbling into a pit with spikes at the bottom, ready to impale me. David had told me once to never go outside alone since he had placed traps everywhere in this area. There was a noise close behind me, and I looked back to see David was following me from a distance, gaining on me. I picked up my pace and began to run again. "Come back," he called after me, his voice sounding different now, distorted and wrong. "It's not safe." Breaking into a sprint, I hoped to lose him in the darkness for a time. It seemed to work. He was slower due to his injuries or his mutations, and was hobbling. When I saw him again, trailing me from a distance, now confident that I'd managed to escape the section of forest where he was hiding his traps, I began to make my way towards the archway. There were certain landmarks David had shown me to find my way back to it, but none of them looked quite the same at night. In fact, nothing looked the same at night. I was starting to worry that I'd become completely lost. When I finally saw the huge oak tree with its one low branch that pointed the way, following David's prior advice, I continued traveling in that direction. After a long period of walking, I realized the sun had begun to rise, looking purple and bloated and wrong, as it always did in this world. But at least it gave another indication of which direction I should be working towards, and it helped to light the way, making the landmarks more obvious as I came across each one. Here was the babbling brook I would follow for a little while, and there was the strange boulder that looked like a face. I felt the pang of regret at leaving David behind after he'd saved my life, showing me how to survive in this world. But then I shook my head and reconsidered. No, I could not go back to that cave. Maybe he was eating rats now, but what if tomorrow he developed a taste for my flesh? What if I woke up to find him hunched over me, eating my leg or my foot? No, going back was not an option. If David was still following me, there was no indication of it. I couldn't hear him chasing me anymore, and he wasn't calling after me, maybe because he was worried about alerting the creatures to his presence. The clearing where the archway had been was not far now. It was just another 10 minutes or so of walking, and I was just hoping it would be there this time. If it wasn't, I was completely unsure of what I would do. I'd been trying not to think about that part of things since the idea of the portal not being there was too much to bear. "Come back," someone called out from the woods, suddenly startling me. It was David again. At least it sounded like him. "Is it safe?" Another voice called out from my right, sounding sped up then slowed down like a tape recorder running low on batteries. Leaves crunched on the ground behind me and ahead of me, and from all angles, there were now voices calling out in distorted tones. "Come back, it isn't safe. Kura isn't safe." The more they said it, the more the words didn't sound like words anymore, but just strange, alien noises. They mingled together in an echoing cacophony of sounds. My heart began to pound against my sternum like a jackhammer from the inside. My palms were sweating as I tried to lift my legs to run, but realized they wouldn't move. It was at that moment that I observed the fact that I didn't have my rifle, and it dawned on me for the first time that I left it back at the cave with David. As that thought went through my mind, the trees and shrubs all around me began to rustle and sway, moving aside to reveal the gray four-armed figures who had been lying in wait. If you know a particular spot, they'll start to wait for you there. They're adept hunters, and they know exactly how to ambush someone. Trust me, I've seen it for myself, David had told me. Yeah, I thought bitterly. He'd seen it firsthand with the rat in the cave as he was turning into one of them. He was becoming a pretty good hunter himself. The pack of creatures closed in on me from all angles, and I sucked in a terrified breath, unable to scream or run or do anything at all. It was hopeless, or so I thought. The blast of the rifle was deafening in the stillness of the forest, and I winced at the sound as it took the head off the creature closest to me, which was just about to grab hold of me. The pack of creatures closed in on me from all angles, and I sucked in a terrified breath, unable to scream or run or do anything at all. It was hopeless, or so I thought. The blast of the rifle was deafening in the stillness of the forest, and I winced at the sound as it took the head off the creature closest to me, which was just about to grab hold of me. "Run!" David screamed from the trees, and this time I could tell very clearly that it was his voice, but at the same time, he looked different. He left his shirt back at the cave, and an extra pair of arms on his abdomen were plainly visible now, and I could see they were holding the rifle with 4 hands, moving rapidly. David reloaded the gun in a fraction of the time, then had the sights up to his eye again and was ready to fire. I did as he asked, trying to pry my eyes away from the horrifying image of what was happening. The creatures were abandoning me to go after a bigger threat, and I saw them stomping through the brush towards him as he fired the gun again, taking off the top of one of their skulls in a bloody spray. A chunk of gray matter landed on my cheek, and I brushed it off in disgust. Getting to my feet, I began to run, but one of the creatures stopped me. The one David had just shot was still alive somehow and grabbing onto my leg, digging its talon-like claws into the flesh of my ankle. Gritting its teeth and staring up at me with a brainless, evil hunger, I screamed in pain, turning away and using my other foot to stomp on the thing's face as it spit out broken teeth. It smiled at me, squeezing and digging its nails in deeper until I could feel blood pouring out and soaking through the fabric of my sock. "Come back," it croaked in David's voice. Finally, I stepped on the thing's arm, wrenching my leg free from its grip. It was like the thing felt no pain at all as it was immediately trying to come after me again with its other good hands. It was like all it desired was to cause pain but felt none of its own. Trying not to think about that, I turned away and began to run, limping on my one injured leg, ignoring the pain as I broke into a sprint. Just as I got out of sight from David, I heard him cry out in anguish. His screams cut short as one of the creatures began to chew on his windpipe, and all that could be heard after that was a hushed gurgling sound far back in the distance as he drowned in his own blood. Somehow, I knew without even seeing it happen that David was dead, but I had no time to mourn for him. I rushed through the trees, trying to ignore the pain in my leg, hoping with every fiber of my being that the archway would still be there. I spoke the words in my mind out loud over and over again like a mantra as the clearing came closer and drew into focus. "Please be there. Please be there. Please be there." And when I came out from the trees into the clearing, I almost couldn't believe my eyes. Was this a dream? A mirage? A fantasy that would disappear when I blinked my eyes and opened them again? No, it was there. It was actually there. The archway was back, and just in the nick of time. Without a moment's hesitation, I ran through it, terrified that it would disappear before I got the chance to step through the threshold and back into my dimension. Like a man terrified of elevators and worried the box will drop out at any second, I leaped through the archway and back into the glorious golden sunlight of our world. I realized immediately what I had been missing, as the blue sky above could be seen through the trees, and I noticed I was truly warm for the first time in days, as if I had been walking in shadow and only now was stepping out into the sun. As I began to walk back towards the road, I took a nervous look back over my shoulder at the archway and froze when I saw the disturbing sight behind me. It was still there. I could still see the purple sky on the other side, and that could only mean one thing. The portal was still open. Terrified of what that implied, I shuddered and continued walking, looking back every so often for creatures and hoping that the archway would disappear this time for good. But it didn't. As I left it behind in the trees and lost sight of it, my last glimpse showed the evil purple sky shining through from the other side, insidiously waiting for another hiker to stumble through, or worse, for something else to emerge from the other side. At least if I have to face another one of those creatures, they'll be on my turf, I thought to myself with some slight reassurance. But I didn't have a weapon, and I would need backup. I wasn't out of the woods yet. After limping through the forest for 10 or 15 minutes, I eventually found the road. A part of me had been worried it wouldn't be there, that this would just be another world that looked like ours, one of a million different potential places that the archway could take you to, and that I would find myself wandering through some unknown forest yet again, set upon by some new breed of ravenous creatures with a thirst for blood. But thankfully this did look like my road, and it had been the one I had been on before. I could even see the distinctive tread marks in the mud from what appeared to be the Jeep, maybe from the day when Ross had dropped me off in this very spot. I felt a twinge of anger at the thought of my supervisor and decided I would let him have it. The moment I saw him, he was supposed to be my backup. I was supposed to be learning from Ross. Instead, he'd let me go out on my own. And now look at what had happened. Limping along the shoulder of the gravel road, I eventually saw the fire tower coming into view up ahead. It came into focus gradually, emerging from the trees that hid it from my sight. The Jeep was there, and I realized instantly what that meant. It meant that Ross was up there. He wasn't out looking for me like he should have been. But then, if he'd been where he was supposed to be, none of this would have ever happened. I climbed the wooden steps leading up to the fire tower, getting more and more enraged as I got further up and closer to the man who I now believed was responsible for all this. My aching leg was bloodied, and I could feel it swelling, my pant leg tightening around it. Finally, I reached the top and threw open the door to find Ross sitting at the table, reading a book, drinking a cup of coffee, and looking quite comfortable. He looked surprised to see me and shocked at the sight of me. "Holy crap," he screamed, almost knocking his coffee cup over. The brown liquid spilled all over the pages of his paperback. "You're back." "That's right, genius," I hissed, limping towards him. I could feel my face turning hot and red. His eyes widened further. What's wrong with your face? Are you okay? You're turning purple." I didn't know what to say to that. I looked in the mirror to my left and saw that he was right. I didn't look like myself at all. I looked like a monster, made of rage at that moment, my face purple with anger. Suddenly, all of the fight left me, and I realized how utterly exhausted I was. I heaved out a great sigh and crumpled to the floor of the fire tower cabin. I collapsed, unable to understand what was happening to me. I didn't feel like myself at all, and as I was sitting there on the floor, I felt something writhing inside of me, a squirming feeling in my abdomen, like fingers reaching out from the inside, trying to poke and tear their way through the skin of my belly. I screamed, pulling out my shirt and clutching my abdomen, feeling the skin for a bulging pair of hands or a face, picturing that scene from the movie Alien. But there was nothing there, no indication of anything growing or mutating inside of me, except a slight tingling there, like fingers gently brushing up against my skin from the inside, tickling me very lightly. "No," I said aloud, still clutching myself tightly. "Dude, what the heck happened to you?" Ross asked, looking at me with grave concern. "You've been gone for 2 days. Yeah, you come back screaming, grabbing at yourself. Your face just went purple like an eggplant, like you had anaphylactic shock for a few seconds. Now it's back to normal again. Tell me, please, because I am genuinely very freaking concerned. What the heck happened to you out there?" I tried to gather my thoughts, trying to figure out how to explain it all. Those things, whatever they are, they're deadly, I said. And they're not from this world. They're smart. They're almost impossible to kill. Right now, they're getting reinforcements. It looks like they're retreating, but they're assembling a hunting party. How can you possibly know all this? He asked, not sure what to make of it at first. Was I about to question you? But then the look on my face seemed to convince him. He ran over to the gun rack on the wall and pulled down his rifle, checking to make sure it was loaded. He took the safety off. Is that David? He asked. I shook my head. No. What the heck did you get us into exactly? He asked nervously. But before I could respond, there was someone at the door. There was a sound of scratching, long nails against the woods, scraping it, and there was a distorted gray face at the window, looking in at us. I'm back, it demanded. Ross held the scope up to his eye and got ready to fire at the door, and then the footsteps began to recede, going back down the stairs. What the heck was that thing? Ross shot again, the blast deafening in the stillness of the forest. He yelled, "Run." I tried to gather my thoughts, trying to figure out how to explain it all. Those things, whatever they are, they're deadly, I said. And they're not from this world. They're smart. They're almost impossible to kill. Ross replied, right now, they're getting reinforcements. It looks like they're retreating, but they're assembling a hunting party. I let him outside and pointed down at them below. They were going back for more of their own kind to bring them into our world as they looked down from the lofty fire tower. I could see them moving quickly into the forest. Some were going back to the archway, but not all of them. They were planning on staying here, making this their new home. After all, there was an abundant food supply and no reason to leave. I tried to sum up what had happened as well as I could in such a short time. It was difficult for him to believe, but the proof had been right in front of us. The monster had been right outside the fire tower, and we'd seen more of them below us. There was no way to fake that. We needed to do something fast. Okay, assuming you and I haven't lost our minds and just hallucinated whatever that thing was, I'll take your word for all this. So what the hell are we going to do? My supervisor asked reluctantly. I considered this for a few long moments. How much gas do we have between the generator and the Jeep? I asked. His eyes went wide after he realized why I was asking. For a while, he didn't answer, but then he nodded his head and waved for me to follow him. Enough, he said. As I follow him down the stairs, there's enough. You might have heard about the wildfire on the news. It was a big one. There was speculation it was caused by hikers or careless campers, but the real reason why the blaze started was never truly discovered. No one would have guessed it was set by 2 rogue park rangers and fire lookouts, no less. The forest fire spread and took out a lot of homes, but everyone who lived in the area made it out alive. Thankfully, no one died. I don't know how I would have lived with myself if they had. I was fired from the park ranger service after that happened, as was Ross. With all the news coverage and social media outrage, someone had to be blamed for what had happened, and we were the most viable scapegoats, especially since we were the first lookouts, and we've been seen fleeing the area long before the blaze was ever reported. Our excuse was that the fire started near the road, and we'd been down by the Jeep when we noticed it, believing our lives were in danger. We'd fled from the area before our escape route could be cut off, and told our supervisors that we hadn't been able to radio in the report until afterward. Unfortunately, there's no way of really knowing if we killed those things, or if we destroy the archway. Maybe it can't even be destroyed. Maybe those things can't be killed. It's been years since all this happened. Terrified of the forest these days, I stay out of the woods, away from nature entirely. I live in a big city, far away from all that business. I work in a high-rise and live in an apartment building. When people ask if I want to go camping, I say, hell no. People tell me I'm strange. They talk about me behind my back. That's okay. One thing that people find peculiar about me is that I never go swimming. I never take my shirt off, and I don't date or try to find a girlfriend. Despite people trying to set me up, I don't want anyone to see the changes that have been happening. The arms that have fully sprouted from my abdomen and have a mind of their own. I try to tie them down, to strap them down with duct tape so they can't move, but they always manage to free themselves. They're very crafty in that way, and they brought with them an unusual appetite. I found myself craving the most disturbing things that crawl and skitter in the subways and in the sewers, things I have to chase and kill and rip flesh from bones with my bare teeth. It scares me to think about what I'm becoming, and part of me will always be terrified. A voice in my mind screaming that this is wrong. I need to get help, but another part of me is getting used to it. A primordial alien part of me is starting to very much enjoy the hunt. I tried to sum up what had happened as well as I could in such a short time. It was difficult for him to believe, but the proof had been right in front of us. The monster had been right outside the fire tower, and we'd seen more of them below us. There was no way to fake that. We needed to do something fast. Okay, assuming you and I haven't lost our minds and just hallucinated whatever that thing was, I'll take your word for all this. So, what the hell are we going to do? My supervisor asked reluctantly. I considered this for a few long moments. How much gas do we have between the generator and the Jeep? I asked. His eyes went wide after he realized why I was asking. For a while, he didn't answer, but then he nodded his head and waved for me to follow him. Enough, he said. As I follow him down the stairs, there's enough. You might have heard about the wildfire on the news. It was a big one. There was speculation it was caused by hikers or careless campers, but the real reason why the blaze started was never truly discovered. No one would have guessed it was set by 2 rogue park rangers and fire lookouts, no less. The forest fire spread and took out a lot of homes, but everyone who lived in the area made it out alive. Thankfully, no one died. I don't know how I would have lived with myself if they had. I was fired from the park ranger service after that happened, as was Ross. With all the news coverage and social media outrage, someone had to be blamed for what had happened, and we were the most viable scapegoats, especially since we were the first lookouts, and we'd been seen fleeing the area long before the blaze was ever reported. Our excuse was that the fire started near the road, and we'd been down by the Jeep when we noticed it, believing our lives were in danger. We'd fled from the area before our escape route could be cut off and told our supervisors that we hadn't been able to radio in the report until afterward. Unfortunately, there's no way of really knowing if we killed those things or if we destroyed the archway. Maybe it can't even be destroyed. Maybe those things can't be killed. It's been years since all this happened. Terrified of the forest these days, I stay out of the woods, away from nature entirely. I live in a big city, far away from all that business. I work in a high-rise and live in an apartment building. When people ask if I want to go camping, I say, hell no. People tell me I'm strange. They talk about me behind my back. That's okay. One thing that people find peculiar about me is that I never go swimming. I never take my shirt off, and I don't date or try to find a girlfriend. Despite people trying to set me up, I don't want anyone to see the changes that have been happening. The arms that have fully sprouted from my abdomen and have a mind of their own. I try to tie them down, to strap them down with duct tape so they can't move, but they always manage to free themselves. They're very crafty in that way, and they brought with them an unusual appetite. I found myself craving the most disturbing things that crawl and skitter in the subways and in the sewers, things I have to chase and kill and rip flesh from bones with my bare teeth. It scares me to think about what I'm becoming, and part of me will always be terrified. A voice in my mind screaming that this is wrong. I need to get help, but another part of me is getting used to it. A primordial alien part of me is starting to very much enjoy the hunt. It was close to 3 o'clock in the afternoon when the knock came on the door to the ranger station. I was mildly surprised to hear it, Given that it was early January in the foothills of the Adirondacks, and the temperature was hovering at a balmy 12 degrees, with the wind chills driving it into the negatives with frustrating frequency. The wind had been howling against the isolated station since before sunrise that morning, and I wondered if I was going to need to deal with any damage to my little abode after the storm blew through. I'd been monitoring the forecast and weather radar all day, and it looked like I was in for quite the blizzard by the time evening rolled around. It had been snowing most of the day already, but so far it hadn't been very heavy. I expected that to change by nightfall, however, which in January was only in another couple of hours. I didn't usually keep the front door to the ranger station locked, since it wasn't uncommon for hikers and campers to make a pit stop on their way up the trail to the observation areas, either to log their camping site for the night, or just in hopes of a nice hot cup of coffee before they continued on their hike. The door hadn't been latched correctly lately, though, and had the tendency to swing open when a strong gust caught it just right, so I'd been keeping it locked until I could repair it. The knocking was light, somehow hesitant, and almost polite, if that makes any sense. It was so quiet that I almost didn't hear it over the whistling of the wind and the creaking of the station. I'd been in the middle of composing an email request for a new generator, as mine had been acting up a bit lately, and had to pause my typing and listen intently to ensure I'd even heard it in the first place. When it came again, only a bit louder, I pushed back from my desk and took another sip from my steaming mug before walking over and opening the door. Outside stood 5 people, 3 men and 2 women, dressed in what looked like expensive and very new cold weather coats and snow pants, all looking very similar except for the various bright colors, and all bearing the familiar North Face logo. Their anxious faces peered out from within their drawn and cinched hoods, and I had to suppress a grin. They looked dressed to climb Everest, not hike the lower trails of the Adirondacks. Tourists, probably European, and probably their first time seeing the sort of weather. I thought it was a fairly common occurrence. Folks from all over the world came to visit these mountains, looking to experience all the beautiful wilderness we had to offer. I wasn't unsympathetic if you weren't used to the unpredictable climate here in the winter. It could quickly catch you by surprise and get dangerous here very quickly. "Hi there," I said cheerfully, stepping back into the doorway and motioning them inside. "Come in out of the snow and warm up by the fire." The man who'd been knocking turned to his companions, said something in Spanish, and then turned back to me with a wide grin and nodded, stepping past me and into the warmth of the station. The rest followed quickly, anxious to get out of the chill wind that was blowing hard outside. As soon as they were all in, I closed the door and locked it to make sure it didn't blow open. "Gracias, sir. I am Martin," said the man, pulling back his hood and unzipping his quilted down coat. He gestured to the others in turn. "This is Lucas, Diego, Sofia, and Triana." I nodded my greeting to each. Martin continued with a smile. "It is very cold. We come to visit from Spain to see your beautiful mountains and enjoy the lovely scenery." His accent was very heavy, but his English was far better than my Spanish, so I didn't have room to criticize. "But it seems a storm is coming, and we fear there will be too much snow. Unfortunately, we are not so prepared for that." I nodded, patting him on the shoulder as I moved past him, and opened the door to the shelter room, reaching in and turning on the lights. "That's certainly true, my friend. I'm afraid we're in for a bit of a blizzard this evening. Bad time for a winter stroll through the mountains," I said. "Fortunately, I happen to have enough space for you and your friends to make yourselves at home and wait out the storm. My name's Jackson Turner, Ranger. There's coffee over there on the table and bunks, and a comfortable seating area in here." When the group just stared at me blankly for a moment, I got the feeling I'd lost most of them somewhere along the way. Instead, I just offered the friendliest smile I had and gestured to the room. They all grinned and nodded their thanks as they quickly shuffled past me, dropping their packs on various bunks and beginning to remove their cold weather gear. I made sure they all got something hot to drink and that they understood they were welcome to stay until the weather had cleared. Before returning to my desk, they all seemed very pleasant and grateful for my assistance, and they drifted from my thoughts as I continued my administrative work. It was another hour before the second knocking rapped to the door. This one was slow and oddly rhythmic, almost like a staccato beat, somehow unsteady and not as tentative as my other guests had been. I hadn't had any visitors to the ranger station in a week or more, and now they were pouring in like this was a Holiday Inn Express or something. I unlocked the door and pulled it open, putting on my official greeting smile once again. In the doorway stood a man, shoulders and hooded head covered in a layer of icy snow. He was roughly my height, about 6'0" or so. Unlike the others, he wasn't dressed in fancy, color-coordinated cold weather gear, but instead wore a mismatched combination of clothes, like he had raided the bargain bin at a second-hand expedition store. His pants were blue quilted nylon and looked more on the expensive side, even if they didn't exactly fit him very well. His coat was fur-lined and looked like it was made of padded wool, layered over an old fleece jacket. His boots looked newer and not too warm, something more suited to a summer hike than a winter in the mountains. I thought, "Hey there," I said as warmly as I could, waving him inside. "Come on and out of the snow." He didn't say anything but gave the slightest hint of a nod as he walked past me. The strong scent of musky body odor followed him, and I wondered if he was one of those reclusive hermits that I'd heard rumors of living out here all by himself in some makeshift shack. I closed the door and locked it again, turning back to the man he'd already taken note of the bunk room to the left where the Spaniards were getting settled. He headed on in and sat on one of the empty bunks in the back corner of the room. He didn't remove his coat or offer any greeting to the others, and I noted with some curiosity that he didn't have any sort of pack with him, which further made me wonder if he lived nearby in some off-grid cabin. I could see that the others were smiling and making pleasantries toward him, but he just sat there, dark eyes quietly watching the activity without a single word. There was the slightest hint of a smile upon his lips, congruous and somehow unnerving. It only took them a few moments to abandon their attempts at including him in conversation and turned back to their own group, speaking quietly in Spanish amongst themselves. For a moment, I wondered if he might be in some sort of shock. The temperature was dropping pretty quickly outside, and it had already been too cold for some of the clothing he wore. I considered giving him a once-over to make sure he didn't have any frostbite or signs of hypothermia, but something about him told me he might not be so welcoming to my attention. I stood there in the doorway of the bunk room for a moment, looking over the scene. Something about the newcomer seemed off. Somehow I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the way he moved, his lack of communication, the way he was just sitting there, perfectly still on that corner bunk, just seemed strange. There was something else too, something that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Something that tickled the back of my brain, just out of reach, more of an instinctive unease than a coherent thought. I found myself hoping the man would spend a few minutes warming himself and then be on his way again, turning my attention to the others. I realized that they must have found something odd with him as well, as they had all subconsciously clustered around the end of the table furthest from him and were speaking more quietly than before, more subdued. I noticed them periodically casting quick, uncomfortable glances in his direction, but never for more than the briefest of moments, as if they were just reassuring themselves that he hadn't moved and was still sitting there. I also noticed, curiously, that none of them sat with their backs to the man. Like also subconsciously, I was just about to walk over and talk to him to shake the odd feeling away when Martin appeared in front of me, his brow furrowed. "Sir, my friends and I are worried about the other campers," he said. I drew my attention. There weren't any campers registered out here today. Was the newcomer one of them? Maybe, I thought. "What campers?" I asked with a frown. "They vaguely to the north. We, passed their campsite on the way to the, observation point before the weather turned us back here. Maybe a half-kilometer up the trail in a clearing beside a small, brook." Martin cast a quick look over his shoulder at the strangers sitting in the corner. There was again that same unease. Martin continued. There were 3 of them, 2 men and a woman. They had some of these cold weather setups and seemed to be well prepared for the storm, at least as far as we could tell. We stopped and warmed ourselves by their fire for a bit. They seemed very experienced and were not concerned about the cold. But I am no expert, I said with my best reassuring smile. They should be okay. Sounds like they should be okay, Martin said. I'm sure they'll be just fine when the storm passes. I'll head up there and check on them, just to make sure. Just to make sure, I asked. Yes, he replied. He flicked his eyes to the man again, and then locked them with mine with a surprising intensity, like he was trying to tell me something with his gaze alone. He lowered his eyes and said, the campers, they were all wearing very good clothing. Sophia's brother is a climber in some very cold regions, and she recognizes the camper's gear is similar to what he uses, even better. I started to respond, but Martin cut me off. Exactly, like the pants that man is wearing now, he said quietly. He had started to walk, but his face was already showing a slight change. With his hodgepodge combination of clothing, the gloves he still wore looked to be thin and ill-suited for the winter weather, but looked well made and would have been fine for a mild autumn outing. He still hadn't moved or said anything, and his emotionless eyes drifted slowly over the Spaniards with what seemed to my growing paranoia like a hungry interest. It was almost like he was inventorying them, evaluating them somehow. Once again, that tickle in the back of my brain, telling me that something was not quite right with the man. Something was just a little out of place, but I still couldn't figure it out. It set my teeth on edge. I looked back at Martin. Are you sure, He shrugged. As sure as we can be. Sophia says she is certain, but the rest of us do not have the experience to recognize these details as well as she does. Was this man with them? I asked, but I already knew the answer. Martin shook his head. No, I have never seen him before now. He leaned in a little closer and lowered his voice. This man, there is something, he said, trailing off, unable to find the right words. I nodded. I know I feel it too. I walked back to my desk and opened a drawer, retrieving the holstered handgun and attaching it to my belt. The spare magazine went into my pocket, and I grabbed my heavy jacket from a bike hook and pulled my fur-lined hat over my ears. Martin followed me, watching with interest. I looked over his shoulder, making sure we were out of sight and earshot of the bunk room. I'm going to check on the camp. Have you ever handled a shotgun? I asked. He nodded. I hunt pheasant with my cousins every year. I am a very good shot. Good, I said. The doorway beside my desk is my room. Right inside, you'll find a 12-gauge pump, loaded but not chambered, if you need it. He just gave a silent duck of his head. I should be back within the hour. I know the place you're talking about. Keep him here until I return, but don't do anything if you don't have to. I said, closing my code and making sure the zippered slit covering my holster was open and accessible. Be careful, Jackson Turner. I feel some darkness in the air. I just gave a tight-lipped nod before opening the door and stepping out into the wind. The icy chill hit me immediately, cutting through my heavy pants and finding its way through every little opening in my clothing. The wind out here was a constant buffeting and howled in my ears. The snow along the trail was only a little over ankle deep, but tugged at my boots with every step, slowing my progress. The area that Martin had described was one of the few marked campsites along this area of the trail, and although it wasn't strictly required for campers to check in before setting up, it was highly encouraged. This deep in the woods -20 miles out from the nearest town, the only real lifeline that anyone had were the rangers. If anything went wrong out here, the fact that you registered with the local ranger station may very well mean the difference between life and death. That didn't mean that everyone followed that rule, though. Most of the time, it was new campers. Those folks lacking some of the wisdom of experience that didn't know or didn't think it was necessary to check in before setting camp. Sometimes it was the opposite. Some highly experienced outdoors folk that felt there was no need, that they could handle anything that came their way. Either way, as I followed that northern trail, a growing unease began to color my steps. I felt a tight grip of anxiousness tickling my every breath. I didn't know what I was going to find. If I was lucky, I'd find 3 cold-weather, double-wall, silicone nylon tents with their occupants snuggled warmly and safely within. If that was the case, I'd just check on them and turn back to my station, hopefully before the worst of the storm came in earnest. If not, well, I'd have to figure that out when it came. An hour later, I'd reached the campsite, or at least what was left of it. The remains of what were obviously 3 high-quality winter tents were positioned compactly around a central fire pit, their bright red material shredded and torn and flapping violently in the fierce wind, looking very much like a lunatic array of flags in the heart of a hurricane. I pulled the ears of my hat lower, adjusting the chin strap tighter. "Hello," I shouted, straining my voice to carry above the wind. Even with all my force, it still sounded pathetically impotent in the roar of the coming storm. "Is anyone here?" I waited a long moment but could hear nothing but the rush of wind and the whip-like snapping of the nylon fabric. The campsite had all the hallmarks of a bear attack, except I hadn't seen a bear in months, and we never had a bear attack in this area. That I'd ever heard of it wasn't like the forest at all. We didn't have brown bears here, just black bears. Yeah, but they were smaller and nowhere near as aggressive as the big browns. Sure, they could be dangerous, especially if startled or threatened, but they didn't actively hunt humans. I took a few more steps forward into the campsite, drawing the Sig Sauer 10mm and holding it at a low ready as I performed a quick visual of the tents. Nothing. No signs of bodies, blood, a struggle, anything at all. Just destroyed tents that could have been abandoned by the campers when the wind started getting bad and the fabric began to fail. Then it caught my eye. A flash of dark gray partially hidden by the snow between 2 of the tents. Another 10 minutes of snowfall, and I'd never have seen it moving closer. I towed the frozen bundle of cloth, overturning it before picking it up with my free hand, keeping the Sig at the ready. It was a pair of thick winter pants, old and torn and covered in dark red-brown stains, which looked too fresh for my comfort. They were fur-lined and looked to be woolen. As soon as I lifted them free of the snow, the wind blew a familiar musky smell into my face, and I dropped them in revulsion. Another 2 feet beyond the hint of blue in the white drift drew my attention, and I cautiously approached. I recognized the puffy material of a cold-weather jacket, and when I reached out to expose more of it, I staggered backward in shock, realizing suddenly that I was looking at a crudely membered arm, still wrapped snugly in its warm jacket sleeve. I cursed aloud and stumbled backward, tripping over the stones surrounding the fire pit and falling hard on my ass. Eyes wide, and not even registering the pain of my tailbone meeting the frozen ground, I sat there hyperventilating for what felt like minutes, long enough that the frigid chill was setting into my legs and backside from where I sat, dumbly in the snow. Eyes wide and breath ragged. It was only when my arms began to shake that I realized I was gripping the handgun as tightly as I could, aimed insanely at the gray mass of frozen trousers on the ground before me. As if they were going to suddenly spring to life and attack, was all I could think to say as rationality suddenly returned, clearing the pulsating red spots from my vision and slamming my thoughts back to the present. Jarringly, the pounding in my ears began to lessen, replaced once again with the unrelenting wail of the wind. I left my feet and started running back along the trail to my station, where Lucas, Diego, Sofia, and the other girl, whose name I couldn't remember, sheltered from the coming storm. With what was he? Some sort of psycho serial killer stalking the lonely hiking trails of upstate New York. That didn't make any sense. I'd been here for 3 years and never heard of anything like this. As I ran clumsily through the snow, which was now halfway up my shin, I thought back to those gray pants discarded at the campsite. They had been shredded, not just torn and ripped from age and wear. It had been something violent that caused the damage, and the blood stains seemed to lend credence to that theory. So whatever had happened, the stranger had decided to replace his damaged and stained pants with what those of his victims had worn. Then I thought about how none of his clothes matched and how his boots and gloves weren't even suitable for winter weather. How long had this been going on? 20 minutes later, the dim yellow lights from the windows of my station appeared suddenly through the nearly white-out conditions that had overtaken me with the full coming of the storm. The temperature had dropped even more, and I was amazed that I had been able to keep my pace up long enough to make it back, driven by adrenaline and fear. I slowed to a halt before my ranger station, noticing immediately how the front door hung open a few inches. My mind urged me forward to go racing in, but I had to take a few moments to catch my breath and let my racing heart slow a bit before I entered. I couldn't understand why the door was only open a few finger widths. If it hadn't been locked, the first strong gust of wind would have blown it open fully, slamming it against the wood paneling of the wall behind it. But what occupied my thoughts far more was the implication of that open door. There's no way it could have been missed by anyone within, and nobody in their right mind would have sat in the station while the freezing wind and snow blew in through the open doorway. I pushed the thought aside and crept as quietly as possible to the door, pushing it gently at first, then with greater force as I felt some resistance holding it closed. I gripped my sidearm tightly, muzzle directed forward and at chest level, finger resting along the frame of the pistol, and ready to drop to the trigger and go to work at a moment's notice. The door gradually gave way and pushed inward far enough that I was able to slide through the gap, the howling of the wind and the protesting of the building blissfully providing enough cacophony to cover the sounds of my entrance. As soon as I stepped inside, I found myself in the center of a feverish nightmare. A body lay behind the door and served as an impromptu barricade. I could only tell that it was one of the women by the delicate shape of the body, as the head and upper torso had been savagely mutilated. The skin and scalp torn away from the red white of the skull viciously, presumably while she had desperately tried to make her escape from whatever hell had pursued her. Blood slicked nearly every surface around me, hot and stinking of copper, and I became aware of a wet tearing sound emanating from the bunk room. The lights in that room were flickering chaotically, the hanging bulb in the center swinging maniacally as if it had been recently struck and was still settling its pendulum motion. As quietly as I could, I ducked around the doorway into that room, fresh shock coursing through my body in a cold wash that threatened my consciousness. Bodies and pieces of bodies lay strewn about the room haphazardly, most still enshrouded in bits of clothing now tacked in place by sticky crimson. I could feel the heat in the room from whatever horrifying act of violence had occurred, the bodies that now lay scattered about like discarded playthings at my feet. I noted a handful of empty shotgun shells where they had fallen and been arrested by the viscous gore that painted the wooden floorboards. The shotgun lay nearby, chamber open and magazine tube empty, only inches away from the barely recognizable remains of the man I'd known as Martin. Terrible slashes and wounds covered his ravaged corpse, looking as if he'd been thrown into a shredder. His limbs were outstretched and only attached by the yellowish tendons and pink muscles, which now lay open and exposed. My eyes were drawn at that moment to the source of the sounds I'd heard before, and I saw the crouched form of the stranger straddling one of the bodies. Lucas, I think, by the bright yellow of his North Face jacket. I watched in horror as the stranger dipped his head again and again, jerking it savagely each time it came away, as if tearing away more bits of meat with each movement. I noticed then that the stranger's hands had somehow grown elongated and taken on a shiny knitness appearance that left the fingers as jagged and gore-crusted claws. After only a moment's hesitation, my reflexes took over, and I snapped the muzzle of my handgun up and squeezed the trigger. I know that the thunderous blast of the 10mm must have been deafening, but I barely registered it as I watched blackened holes appear in the back. It threw its head back, and what I can only hope was pain, and cried out in a shrieking screech that drowned out all else. I squeezed the trigger again, and another bullet punched its way through the horrifying thing, suddenly almost faster than I could track. The stranger exploded up from where he had been feasting and lit upon the wall, his terrible claws sinking into the wood and holding it in place as he turned his head 180 degrees to face me. The eyes had turned completely black and grown to the size of golf balls, and the jaw looked almost as if it had disjointed from its skull. The skin at the corners of his mouth was drawn back in a hideous grin that stretched nearly from ear to ear, exposing a mouth full of shark-like triangular teeth now stained bright red. He tensed, and an instant later, he leaped to the next wall, gripping the exposed wood like some monstrous insect. His eyes fixed upon me before I could make another move. I fired again and again, my panic-induced attack miraculously finding purchase more often than not, as empty brass casings ejected against the doorframe next to me, ringing out like death bells. Then there was a long moment of silent stillness in the room, and his black eyes were fixed on me, still unnervingly cold and alien. I tensed, waiting for the thing to pounce toward me, but it was clear I'd heard it. I don't know how badly, but black ear dripped from a half-dozen wounds punched by my hollow points, and I thought I heard a sickly rattling in its low, deep breaths. With a final ear-splitting, otherworldly shriek, it leaked again, this time away from me, and through the window at the rear of the room. The glass shattered outward, and then it was over. I stood alone in this charred house, left only with the remains of the 5 Spanish tourists and the disconcerting awareness that the slide of my handgun was locked back, smoke lazily drifting from the barrel, and the magazine now empty. That was almost a year ago, and I've since transferred from field operations to an administrative position within the Park Service. My office is located in the middle of the city, surrounded by people, and without a lonely forest or dark wilderness in sight. After the investigation died down, and the deaths were ruled as animal predation, I tried to return to my old posting, but I just couldn't do it. They tore down the old station and built a new one closer to the trailhead, and I thought I could get past it. But I kept seeing that stranger, that creature, every time I closed my eyes. A few times in the dark stillness of the night, I thought I could hear that banshee wail echoing in the distance. Once or twice, I think I heard more than one. I slept with my handgun on the nightstand and the shotgun propped next to my bed. I kept the doors locked at all times, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, maybe searching for me. Maybe it needed to make sure that I wasn't able to tell anyone about it. You see, in the time since that horrible night, I've scoured the internet for any possible explanation of what I saw. I consulted any self-proclaimed cryptozoologist or paranormal investigator that would speak to me, but nobody had any rational explanations beyond fairy tales and urban legends. Invariably, I was left with as many questions as I started with. And then I tripped across an article one day that changed everything for me. It was a piece written about something called the uncanny valley, an idea put forth by some Japanese roboticist back in the 70s. At first, I almost passed it over since it seemed mostly to relate to robotics and computer graphics and how people feel increasingly uncomfortable the more realistically human they appear. But then I read a theory about why people may react this way, and how it may be an evolutionary artifact left over in the dark corners of our reptilian brains, about how at some point in our distant shared history, there may have actually been predators that looked almost human. They may have appeared so close to our ancestors that they were able to blend in with us almost perfectly. According to the theory, primitive humans may have developed a keen sense of facial recognition as a survival mechanism. This may have been passed down through genetic memories, fading just a little with each generation until today, where it existed as little more than an instinctive warning when we looked at someone who wasn't quite right, someone who seemed almost normal, but perhaps with the slightest of imperfections that made them seem just a little wrong. Someone our instincts told us didn't belong. Someone who wasn't really one of us at all. I wondered if these things have been with us all along, hiding among us, stalking us from within our own numbers. Yesterday on my commute to the office, I noticed a young woman sitting by herself in the back of the subway car. Even though it was crowded, the seats beside her were empty, and I noticed that the other commuters almost seemed to be avoiding getting too close to her. I don't think anyone really realized it, but people kept glancing uneasily at her from the corners of their eyes. There was nothing overtly out of place with her, and it could have just been happenstance that nobody had elected to sit down next to her. I just couldn't shake the feeling, though, that something just felt off. Alaskan caretaker. I'm a seasonal caretaker at a national park in Alaska. I won't say which one because I still value my job, and I've been warned by my employers to keep my mouth shut about anything unusual I've seen during my time here. That being said, there are some very strange things that I've seen over the last 3 years, and I figure I'd share some with you. You may not even be aware of what a seasonal caretaker is, and that's completely understandable. Generally, it's not that exciting. If I'm being honest, I start my season when the park is closed for the winter, and it's my responsibility to make sure that the various cabins and public buildings are maintained and the snow is kept cleared from the roofs to prevent any damage. That sort of thing. It's a lonely job, and if you're a people person, it's probably not for you. It takes a bit of an odd duck to willingly put themselves into exile for 3 months at a time, knowing that there's no way out until the snow begins to melt and the plows can start clearing some of the access roads that lead out to my cabin. I do have a snowmobile that I can use to take the 3-hour trip to the nearest ranger station if I need to, but it's not like a quick trip to the corner store. It's just fine for me, though. I've always been a bit of a loner, and I have Max, my Jack Russell Terrier, to keep me company. The job isn't very demanding. I typically only spend a few days each week tending to my responsibilities, and the rest of the time is mine to do with as I please. A few years ago, I took up nature photography as a hobby to pass the time, and I've even had a few of my pictures published by an organization you'd recognize by the name. I have framed copies of those magazines on the wall behind me right now. As a matter of fact, a lot of people come through this park during the more temperate months. It's probably one of the most popular places for outdoorsy folks to come explore in this region of Alaska. In the winter months, however, it's completely deserted except for a few lonely ranger stations and the like. I'll go for weeks at a time without seeing a soul, and the only person I speak with any regularity is my ranger buddy. We'll call him Rick, who I check in with a few times a week on the radio. Aside from that, it's just me and Max. I'm not sure how best to go about telling you about some of the things I've seen up here in the dark, frozen days of winter, so I'll just dive right in and tell you about the shades. At least that's what I call them when I'm talking to myself. I have no idea what they really are, but when the winter storms are blowing strong against my shuttered cabin windows and the visibility in the snow and dim light is next to nothing, you'll see them. It's almost like looking at someone moving behind a pane of frosted glass, all distinct and shadowy at first. I just thought my mind was playing tricks on me, finding patterns in the chaotic static of all that falling snow. But then I started hearing them as well, like murmurings just loud enough to hear over the howl of the wind, but too quiet to recognize them as any sort of intelligent speech. It's enough to set you on edge. I can tell you that they tend to only show up during a heavy snowstorm, and the fiercer the storm, the closer they'll come to the cabin. It's gotten to the point where I'll make sure I've locked all my doors and windows long before nightfall if I know there's a storm coming. One time during an especially nasty blizzard, I could actually hear them moving around my cabin like some sort of nightmare parade. That night was bad. At one point, I actually saw and heard the doorknob on my front door turning, all slow and deliberate, accompanied by what sounded like soft scratching on the wooden surface. The worst part, and I'll swear on a stack of Bibles that it's the truth, was the faint whispering that kept calling my name just on the other side of the door. It went on for an hour or more, and even now, if I close my eyes, I can still hear that cold, hollow voice. It's what I imagine a person would sound like if their soul were ripped from their body. I suppose I'm being a little overly dramatic, but it's the only way I can describe it. Alive, but also lifeless. I don't know a better way to explain it. No reason to dwell on it. I guess. I will say that I'm not sure what would have happened if I hadn't remembered to throw the deadbolt that night. I'm not interested in finding out, but thinking about it makes me anxious. I mentioned it to Rick the next day after the storm had quieted, when I could get a radio signal out. I expected him to laugh at me for letting myself get all spooked by the dark, but he didn't. He very calmly and firmly told me that it was better not to talk about them at all, and to just make sure I kept myself locked up nice and tight when the heavy snowstorms came. I tried to pry him for more information, but he just refused to elaborate any further. The only thing he would add was that not everything sleeps when winter comes on up here. I have to admit, he creeped me out even more with that little zinger. He definitely knows something about them. And I'm going to try to pin him down one day and get more information. The next thing on the list is the car graveyard. I kid you not. If you explore far enough off the beaten trail out here, chances are pretty good you'll find one. A car or truck just inexplicably deposited in the middle of backwater, Alaska. Like that makes no sense at all. The first one I ever saw was an early 2000s BMW coupe, looking like it was just off the showroom floor except for the fact that half of it was embedded in an old spruce that had probably stood there since before cars even existed. It almost looked like the tree had grown around the car, or maybe the car had been interposed into the tree. I don't know how it's possible. I just know it was there. I've seen a few of them during my time here, sometimes trapped in the trees like that BMW, and sometimes just sitting in the middle of an open space of ground. Every one of them looked like they were fresh off the road, and none of them had any logical way they could have gotten out there, even without the hole stuck in the trees part. The most unnerving thing about the cars, though, is the clothing. I've stopped looking and just tend to avoid going anywhere near one if I see it. But the first time I saw one, my curiosity led me to check it out. I tried the open doors, but they were all locked. When I looked through the windows, though, I saw the damnedest thing in the front seats. It looked like someone had laid out clothes. Pants, shirts, socks, shoes, the whole deal, and strapped the seat belts around them. It was like the people in the car had just vanished mid-drive, leaving their clothes behind just the way they'd been wearing them. Eerie is one word for it, but if I'm being honest, it scared the hell out of me. The other thing about the cars is that you won't find the same one twice. When I saw that first BMW, I came back out the next day with my camera to take a picture of it, but it wasn't there anymore. I thought I'd simply forgotten where it was, or I'd gotten turned around. But then I saw my boot prints in the snow from the day prior, and I knew I was in the right spot. I tried to report this to the rangers as well, but Rick told me they wouldn't even send someone out to investigate them anymore. By the time anyone got there, they'd be gone. Apparently, reports of this sort of thing have been coming in periodically over the last 20 or 30 years, and nobody knows anything about them. He did tell me that one of the rangers had found one once. A school bus from Texas, if you can believe that. In each of the rows of seats were piles of empty clothes, with the exception of the driver. The ranger that found it said the driver was sort of there, but not really, almost like a blurry hologram, frozen in time. The frozen driver, an elderly man, looked like he was frozen in some terrified scream, wide-eyed and gaping mouth. The ranger tried to get into the bus using the rear emergency door, but when he got the door open, a loud buzzing sound filled his ears, and a high-frequency vibration ran through his body like an electric shock. He said the closer he got, the more intense the sound and sensation became. Before he could take even a step inside the bus, it grew so strong that he thought he was going to pass out. The best he could describe it was like when you have two strong opposing magnets that you're trying to push together. The more you push, the stronger the resistance becomes. He said it was almost like the universe was somehow keeping him out of that bus, like he didn't belong in it. He stumbled away from it and spent the next day in bed, sicker than a dog. When he came back out a few days later with some other rangers, the bus was gone. I can't really speak for the buzzing and vibrating. Personally, I just know that I avoid them whenever I see them. They're just not right. The last thing I'll tell you about is the bridge. About a mile or so away from my cabin along a maintained footpath, there's a rope bridge that crosses a deep ravine. To the side of it, there's a bit of rock jutting out that's used as a kind of observation point. You know what I mean, where hikers will stop and take selfies along their trek to post on Facebook or Twitter or whatever. The Parks Department even went through the trouble of installing handrails along the edge of it to prevent anyone from falling to their death. Of course, there aren't any hikers here during the winter season. The park is technically closed, and all roads leading into the area are blocked by chains to prevent anyone from driving in and getting into trouble with no possibility of rescue. I hike down that path probably once a week, looking for new photo opportunities to occupy my time. It's a beautiful walk, and the whole landscape seems so crisp and fresh without people trotting all over it. I've gotten some incredible shots of the bridge, but I don't dare step onto it when it's this cold. The boards are constantly frozen and slick with ice. I'm pretty sure it wouldn't take much of a misstep to fall on my ass and slide out from under the waist-high rope handholds. I'd be falling 200 feet to the rocks below before I even realized what was happening. Here's the weird part, though. Invariably, when I reach that bridge, I'll find multiple sets of footprints leading up the rocky outcropping, but none of them leading away from it. They'll come from all different directions, some from the path, and others straight out from the trees, but they all seem to stop at the edge of the ravine. They're various sizes and stride lengths, some of them very small and others so large they have to have been made by some massive hulking person. The first time I saw them, I was afraid that some trespassers had gotten too close to the edge and fallen over. But when I spent the better part of a day making my way carefully to the floor of the ravine, I couldn't find any sign that anyone had been there besides me. I'll be the first to admit that I'm no tracker, but even I can tell when footprints in fresh snow lead to a place and don't return. I've walked out onto that outcropping myself once to see if I could figure out where all these people had gone. Maybe there was a hidden path that I wasn't seeing, but the moment my foot touched that stone, my head began to throb like I was suffering from the worst hangover I'd ever had. When I staggered back from it, the pain disappeared like it had never been there, and I was left with a pretty insistent nosebleed for the rest of the afternoon as my only souvenir. I didn't try again. Max won't even go anywhere near it. He'll start whining as soon as we start approaching that part of the trail. Mind you, this is a dog that I've had to wrestle inside the cabin on multiple occasions because he's so incensed that a pack of wolves dared wander too close to his territory. For all of his small stature, he doesn't seem to have the self-preservation gene that tells him when he should be afraid of something. But not the overlook, though. That's a different story altogether. Even Max has his limits. I guess I have more stories, but I'm getting a little tired, and it's about time for me to get some sleep. Tomorrow, I need to head out to the cabins by the frozen lake and make sure the roofs are clear. I'll write a bit more later. Next time, I'll tell you about the dead bears. That's a strange one. Hey all, it's me again. First of all, wow, I didn't expect this sort of response. Thanks for all the great feedback on my previous post. Honestly, I wasn't sure how interested anyone would be in some of the things going on out here, and I was more than a little surprised when I got back to my cabin yesterday and saw the responses. Before I get rolling with some more experiences I've had out here, I just wanted to address a few questions or comments that folks have made on my last update. Someone suggested that I should try to capture the shades with my camera. That's a good suggestion, and I've already tried that on a couple of occasions. The issue I've run into is that because of the darkness and the snow, I only really have two options. Either use a flash or some other light source, or else use a long shutter speed on my cameras. Even though I was pretty sure neither one would work, I've actually tried both methods. Unfortunately, as anyone who has driven in a snowstorm can attest, snow is great at reflecting light, which is why you can't use your high beams when driving in it. The light just reflects off the snow and back into your eyes, effectively blinding you. My results using this method were about what you'd expect. Nothing but a complete whiteout of the captured images. Using a slow shutter speed didn't yield any better results. All I got were images of completely incomprehensible motion blurs. I suppose there are probably better camera rigs out there that may be able to overcome some of these challenges, but I don't know of them. Even if they do exist, they're probably well outside my budget. The National Park Service doesn't exactly pay seasonal caretakers in gold bullion. There was also a concern that even though I'm trying to remain anonymous, I've given away enough details about myself that my employers could easily identify me. Don't worry about that. Firstly, there are more than 20 national parks in Alaska covering over 50 million acres of land. Believe it or not, it actually contains the majority of the national park land in the entire United States, something like 65% of it. As you can imagine, there are a lot of folks spread out across the state doing similar jobs to mine. It's hard to envision exactly how expansive Alaska is and how much of it is covered with stark wilderness until you've been here and seen it for yourself. I guess that I didn't have the faintest clue before I got here from the lower 48. I guess the bottom line is that it's pretty unlikely that anyone from the NPS will be able to identify me from what I've told you about myself. If they do, I guess we'll cross that bridge then. Finally, someone asked me about the license plates I've seen on some of the vehicles that mysteriously appear out here in the wilderness, and whether they were all from one area or from all over. I previously mentioned that I tend to avoid them if I come across them anymore, but I can tell you that the first car I ran across, the BMW, had a European-style license plate on the front. I assumed at the time it was just one of those trendy plates that folks in the US sometimes put on the front of their European cars for decoration. But it's possible that it was legitimately from somewhere in Europe. I'm not sure. I recall that it was white and blue, but beyond that, I don't remember much about it. Of course, the bus that the ranger found had Texas plates on it, but I don't know about any others. Sorry. Okay, so now that I've cleared those points up, let's dive into some of the other things going on out here. Since I mentioned it in the previous post, I'll start off with the bears. So you probably know this, but Alaska has some of the largest and most dangerous bears in the entire world. Fortunately, the Kodiak and the polar bear aren't generally found inland up here, but we still have more than our fair share of grizzlies and large black bears, both of which are apex predators and will make quick work of the unwary or unprepared. Now, since my contract covers the colder winter months, most of these bears are hibernating during my time here. That being said, not all bears hibernate, especially if they're in an area of plentiful food supply. Also, even when they are hibernating, they'll still become pretty active from time to time. So you definitely can't let your guard down if you want to stay on the side of the grave. It's a pretty safe bet that anyone who works up here, especially alone, tends to carry a rifle as well as a large caliber handgun whenever they're outside of their cabin. I'm no exception to that. I carry a 45 to 70 lever action over my shoulder and a 500 Magnum revolver in a chest holster. At first glance, it may seem like overkill. That is, a tremendous amount of firepower. After all, however, the first time you catch a glimpse of a mama grizzly with her cubs and realize that you're looking at an 800B predator that can run you down in a heartbeat, you'll start wondering why I don't carry even more. The reason I mentioned all this isn't to give you the impression that there's some sort of mythical monsters hiding behind every tree, just waiting to pounce. Only that they represent the top of the food chain up here. Period. Nothing, and I mean nothing, short of a pack of starving wolves will even threaten one, and even that's only been documented on a handful of occasions. They're massive, powerful, and aggressive, and if you live out in their territory and don't keep your head on a swivel, you're an idiot and probably soon to be converted into bear food. So all that being the case, I'm sure you'll understand what it means when I tell you something is killing big grizzlies out here. I'm not talking about poachers or indigenous hunters or anything like that. I'm talking about something as in not humans, and definitely not hungry wolves. But let me back up a step. My first season up here as a winter caretaker was a hell of a learning experience. Just trying to figure out the necessary maintenance routines and learning how to navigate around my area of responsibility was a little overwhelming. One day, I was returning from making my rounds out to one of the ranger stations that was shut down for the winter and ended up taking a wrong turn on the trail. By the time I realized my mistake, I was already a fair distance along the new path and wandering into unfamiliar territory. Just as I was getting ready to turn around and retrace my steps, I spotted a bear and was suddenly faced with the unmistakable form of a grizzly, about 30 feet along the path ahead and facing away from me. I've got to tell you, I almost pissed myself as I fumbled to unsling my rifle off my shoulder. It's a damn good thing I didn't actually need it at that moment, because I discovered, to my dismay, that I had stupidly slung my shoulder pack over the top of the rifle sling, effectively trapping it against my body. Stupidity and complacency are what get you killed out here, folks, and I could have been a perfect example of both at that moment. As it turns out, the bear wasn't moving. It was just standing there, perfectly still, its hindquarters facing me, and I knew instinctively that something was wrong with it. Giving up on my rifle, I grabbed my handgun from its holster and cautiously approached the grizzly, my eyes intent on the bear and prepared for the slightest hint of movement. The closer I got to it, though, the more certain I became that it wasn't going to suddenly lunge at me and give me a lesson on exactly where on the food chain I was placed. Here's where it gets surreal. Before I got close to it, I had already recognized that it was dead. What I couldn't explain was why it was still standing. It had clearly been there for a while, as there were no paw prints leading up to it in the snow, and as I rounded to the front of it, I could see the flesh around its muzzle was already starting to decompose and pull back from its skull. When I got a good look at it, I could see that it was missing chunks of fur here and there. Despite all that, it was still standing, like it had died and just forgotten to fall down. I looked it over pretty closely. Still an unnerving exercise, dead or not, but I couldn't find any sort of wounds or blood that might indicate why it had died. It was then that I realized a couple of things. Firstly, that there were grizzlies in the area that were active, and secondly, nothing had scavenged the carcass. To say this is unusual is an understatement. Most of the top carnivores in this area, including wolves, wolverines, and foxes, supplement their diets by scavenging on carrion. The fact that this bear had died and remained completely intact wasn't just perplexing, it was unnatural. I reported the find to the ranger station and heard back later from Rick that there had been nearly a dozen other similar discoveries within that general area in the last 2 months. The NPS had even brought in some fancy zoological pathologists from Anchorage to figure out what had killed the bears. They spent 2 weeks in the field with the rangers, examining the carcasses, and then one morning, they were just gone. They had apparently been abruptly recalled without so much as a bye. They left immediately after that. The carcasses were destroyed, and the investigation shut down a week later. A rushed and astonishingly brief report came back indicating death by natural predation. No further investigation indicated natural predation. I'm not sure how a predator could have killed the bear I found without leaving a single mark on it or a trace of blood, let alone somehow keep it standing upright after death, and then deciding it wasn't even going to feed on the kill. I called Rick, and so did the rangers. Rick told me his boss had tried to contact the pathologist for more information, but was told that they had all been reassigned and were no longer working with the Park Service. Not one to easily give up, Rick's boss tried calling a private cell number he had gotten from one of the pathologists during their visit. It went to a disconnected message indicating the phone was no longer in service. This was strange because he had just spoken to the investigator using that very number only a couple of weeks prior, so he knew it was a good number. But late that night, he received a call from an unknown caller. When he answered, he recognized the hushed voice of the pathologist he had befriended, sounding like they were whispering into their phone. "Leave it alone, forget about it," was all they said before the line went dead. He tried calling the number back several times, but it just went to dead air each time. That was the last time he heard anything about it. He tried following up within the NBS, but somehow nobody was able to find the records that such an investigation had ever existed, or even that any reports of the dead bears had been filed in the first place. Rick told me that for a while, it was all his boss wanted to talk about. It had become like a splinter in his hand that he couldn't ignore. He called anyone he could think of in the chain of command at the NPS and any other agencies he thought might be able to provide some clue about what was going on, but couldn't make an inch of headway. Then one day, he just stopped talking about it like a switch had been thrown. One evening, Rick and his boss were having beers at the local bar after their shift and talking about how strange the whole thing was. And then the next morning, his boss walked in looking a little shaky and out of sorts. He went into his office, closed the door, and didn't say 2 words to Rick that day. He never mentioned the incident again. A few times Rick had brought it up in conversation with him later on, and his boss just brushed the whole thing off and changed subjects, looking very uncomfortable about the whole thing. I don't know what happened, but if I had to guess, I'm thinking that his boss was probably digging into something that wasn't meant to be dug into, and someone had convinced him it was better if he just forgot about it. Look, I'm not some conspiracy theorist nutjob. Okay, I just know that the whole thing stinks to high hell, and I'll just leave it at that. The other thing I'll tell you about today is what we call the Witch's Lodge. I'm not sure what it was originally. It's really not much more than a single-room log cabin built out in the deep bush. I've seen it a couple of times and been inside once. It's a bit of a hike from my post and not somewhere easily traveled to, even by snowmobile, so I don't get out that way very often. Old, abandoned cabins aren't really that unusual up here. You'll trip across them from time to time, although most aren't much more than a few walls and a collapsed roof after the years of harsh Alaskan winters. The Witch's Lodge is a little different, though. As far as I'm aware, nobody's lived there for a long time, but whoever built it must have known what they were doing because it looks every bit as solid and maintained as my own cabin. I'm not even sure how it got its name. Honestly, I just know that's how it was introduced to me the first time, so that's how I'm introducing it to you. A couple of years ago, my ranger buddy Rick radioed me up, asking if I wouldn't mind joining him in a search for a couple of missing hikers, a father and his 12-year-old son. I'm just a caretaker. I don't normally participate in ranger or search and rescue related activities, but apparently there wasn't anyone else available to accompany him on that day, and he had gotten a lead that the hikers may have been heading out into my section of the park. In search and rescue efforts, especially during the dark Alaskan winters, finding someone quickly is critical if you want to find them alive. So he wanted to follow up on it sooner rather than later. Of course, I couldn't exactly refuse to help him, especially not when one of them was just a kid. So, a couple of hours later, I found myself trailing behind him through the knee-deep snow. We moved along a semi-familiar path for a while before we turned left at a fork and started making our way along another that I wasn't familiar with. He seemed like he knew where he was headed, like he had a particular destination in mind. And we really didn't talk much during the hike. We stopped a couple of times to rest and sip some hot coffee from our thermoses, but even then we were both quiet. I think there was some sort of dark cloud hanging over his mood. I could see it in his narrowed eyes and drawn brow. It was infectious and soon started manifesting itself in the back of my own mind. An hour later, we came across the place. I was surprised to see this perfectly preserved little cedar log cabin just sitting out here among the trees and looking for all the world like someone would come walking out the front door at any moment. Something about the place seemed off, though. Somehow, I knew that nobody lived there, that nobody had lived there in a long time. I can't explain it, but at that moment, I had this strange feeling that we weren't welcome there, like something was telling me to turn around and head back while I still could. Before I had a chance to open my mouth about it, Rick turned to me and pointed towards the closed front door, where I could clearly see the boot prints at his threshold. "Come on," he said over the wind that had just blown up. I could see the grim set to his expression before he turned away from me and started making his way towards the door. I noticed that he had drawn his handgun, so I did the same, though I had no idea why. We reached the entryway to the cabin, and he put his hand on the latch before lifting it. He paused and looked back at me with that same dark expression. "We're going to have to look," he said. "Look inside." "Look inside?" I asked, more confused than anything else. "There's nothing to be found in there," he said. "Fine, just turn around and head back to your cabin for a couple of glasses of whiskey by the fire. Maybe the other groups will find him then." His eyes fixed hard on mine, like he wanted to make sure I was paying damn good attention to him. "But if we find anyone other than that idiot hiker and his kid inside, we're not going to look at them, and we're not going to say a single word to them. Understand? Even if they talk to us first." I nodded at him, more confused than anything else, but that wasn't good enough. "I need you to say it, John, to make sure you understand what I'm telling you," he said, and the set of his eyes was so serious and determined that I repeated his instructions back to him without a second thought. When I did, he gave a brief nod and lifted the latch, pushing the door inward. We stepped through the doorway and into the darkened room. Beyond, as soon as we did, I was overwhelmed by the stench of decay mixed with a strong sense of herbs and something else. Something sickly riding just under the surface of that. My eyes had just started to adjust to the dim light of the interior, and I was able to make out the sparse furnishings of the room. An old rickety table with a solitary low-back chair in front of a cold stone fireplace along the far wall. I thought I could just make out a cot, but I couldn't be sure. "Damn it, it's happened again," Rick said almost under his breath, with a tone of warning in his voice. It drew my attention immediately. I turned to find him kneeling next to the desiccated husk of a man's body dressed in gray snow pants and a red down jacket, slumped back against the wall. It looked like it had been there for years, and I stumbled backward in shock without realizing it. "What the hell?" I exclaimed, not really knowing what else to say. Rick picked up something that was resting on the floor near the man's skeletal hand, looked around briefly at the room, and then nodded to the door. "Time to go. I'll let the search and rescue team know that we found the hikers," he said. I was more than a little confused. The body we were looking at was almost mummified. It had clearly been there for a long time, and I told him as much, not to mention the fact that there was only one of them. If it was possible that this was the father, that still meant that the son was somewhere out there. "It's too late, John," was all he said, pressing something into my hands as he passed me and stepped out the door. I looked down and realized I was holding a small notebook, like the kind of person might keep in their pocket just in case they needed to write something down. Numbly, I flipped it open. It was mostly empty except for the first 2 pages, which were scrawled in a sloppy cursive and pencil. "We found her cabin. God, I wish we hadn't. Nathan's gone. She took him. I've been wandering around in here for days, but I can't find my way out. I haven't seen Nathan or her since that first day. My boy is gone. How can I not find my way out? What's happening?" I can hear her whispers taunting me, but it's always just a little further forward, around the next corner. I don't understand any of this. I'm so sorry. As it turns out, we did end up heading back to my cabin. Rick radioed the search and rescue team that he found the hikers in the lodge, and the person on the other end paused a long moment before replying with a simple acknowledgement. No questions, nothing else, just acknowledge. "Rick, we didn't say much to each other that night. We just sat in front of my fire and drank the rest of my Jameson until we both passed out. When I returned to consciousness the next morning, Rick had already gotten up and left. We haven't spoken about it since that day. The notebook was gone when I awoke, so I assume he took it with him. Clearly, he knows something about what happened at that cabin, but I've never asked him about it. I'm not too sure I really want to know. It's hard enough to sleep at night out here." Sometimes, speaking of which, I suppose it's time for me to sign off and get some shut-eye. It's already almost 2 a.m., and I've got a long day's work ahead of me tomorrow. It snowed pretty good today, and I was already behind in clearing the roof of the storage sheds over near the old firewatch tower. I'd rather not have to deal with the damage if the roof collapses, so I better get over there as soon as it lets up. Some outside. I'll write some more soon. Good night, all. I'm back again, but I think this may be my last post. It sounds like I may have attracted the attention of someone I didn't intend to, and after this update, I'm going to lay low and try to disappear. Let me bring you up to speed. First thing this morning, I was getting suited up and ready to head out to the storage sheds near the old firewatch tower. I heard a knocking on the door of my cabin. Being in the middle of a closed national park in the heart of an Alaskan winter, you can imagine I don't get very many visitors. The only guys I even see out here are my ranger buddy Rick and the guy who brings me fresh supplies every few weeks. Rick has never just shown up at my door without calling on the radio first, and I know he's had his hands full recently with a few separate incidents of missing hikers and one self-professed cryptozoologist. So I was surprised to hear his muffled voice calling my name through the locked door when I opened it and ushered him inside. I saw immediately the concern set to his expression. Without a word, he stepped over to the fireplace and warmed his hands in front of the freshly smoldering log. "Hell, Rick, you gave me a bit of a start," I told him with a small chuckle, trying to lighten the air a little. Something was up, and I had a sinking feeling that it might have something to do with me. He turned away from the fire and looked at me a long moment in silence before speaking. "I got a call last night, John," he said, his face creased with a frown. I couldn't tell whether it was one of worry or muted anger, or maybe a combination of both. "Oh yeah," I replied, trying to keep the tone as casual as I could. I hadn't discussed these posts with Rick since I started updating them. Sure, we chatted about the possibility of me doing some in the past, but I hadn't told him that I'd actually written them. As far as he knew, I was just blowing smoke. My palms began to sweat despite the fact that my cabin's internal temperature was probably in the low 50s. Even with the fire in the hearth, I'd been so sure that there was no way the NPS or the agency or anyone else could figure out who'd been writing these posts. I didn't stop to consider that they didn't need to figure it out themselves. All they needed to do was start poking around at the rangers in various areas. See, there's no way that anyone who wasn't intimately familiar with this area could have identified it just by the details I'd given. I've even made sure to change the names of places and alter the descriptions of some of the events a little, just to try to make it that much more impossible for anyone to figure out who exactly or where I was. In retrospect, my mistake was obvious. If I was trying to identify the source of these posts, I'd probably go directly to the rangers who knew the territory even better than I do. I made the mistake of thinking that my friendship with Rick was strong enough for him to look the other way to cover my ass. See, the Witch's Lodge isn't really known by that particular name around here. I just made that up as an alias for its real one. But I'm sure Rick would have been able to identify it immediately by reading what I've written about it. The same goes for the other stories too, and I'm also pretty sure that the other rangers would be able to recognize them for what they really were now that I'm really thinking about it. Asterisky messed up good this time. Asterisk okay. So here's the deal. There are things that happen out here more than I told anyone about, more than I was ever planning on alluding to in these posts. Things that they do out here and things they definitely do not want anyone to know about. I thought I was being so clever by sharing this with you all and disguising the details enough that they couldn't be deciphered and traced back to me. Asterisk Rick tilted his head at me and gave me one of those looks that told me he wasn't in the mood for any games right now. Asterisk. "You know the stories I'm talking about, John," he said in a flat tone. "The ones that I've told you time and again were a bad idea. The ones that I told you were going to get you into trouble." I tried to shrug it off, to downplay it. Hell, there were just a few stories on the internet, Rick. I was just having a little fun. Gets lonely out here. We go stir crazy sometimes. You know that. "Yeah," he replied. "Well, these little stories have stirred up trouble for us both. he said, settling his hat on the chair and turning away from me back towards the fireplace. They know who wrote them. They know who you are. I just stood there in shocked silence, mouth hanging open as I stared at my friend's back, sudden comprehension flooding my thoughts. My eyes grew wide. You told them? I asked, stunned. How could I have been so naive? Rick had a job to do. We, all of us, had jobs to do out here. We all answered to people. We all knew the score. He didn't turn to face me, but I could see his head fall a little in resignation. His face was probably twisted up in frustration at my recklessness, at the position I'd put him in. If I had to guess, I hoped there was a little regret there too. I'd like to think that our friendship had been real enough. What did you expect? Did they just look the other way again? This isn't the first time you've pulled this stunt, John, he said, glancing over his shoulder at me. I could see the darkness in his eyes, in that brief moment the resolve that had turned his features to stone, and I knew it was coming. The crackling of the flames from the fireplace almost covered the quiet sound of a fastener being unsnapped, but not quite. He was quick, but I had the advantage. Before he even had the chance to spin around to face me, my magnum was out of its holster and thundering with unimaginable violence in the small confines of the cabin. The air filled with acrid smoke, and the afterimage of the muzzle flash glowed in my eyes, superimposed over the dim firelight. Rick staggered to his left, his own handgun falling to the floor as he reached up to clench the blackened hole in the chest of his jacket, which was now already growing red from the terrible wound beneath. He looked up at me, and I could see the realization in his eyes of what had just happened. He reached out to steady himself against the mantel, gasping for breaths that now had a horrible wet rattle to them. "I'm sorry, Rick," I said, grabbing my pack from beside the door and slinging my rifle over my shoulder with trembling hands. I screwed it all up. I'm sorry about all this. He didn't hear me, though. He had slumped to the floor and now stared vacantly at nothing, his blood pooling and spreading from beneath him across the wooden planks. He was gone. That was this morning. I took off out of my cabin as quickly as I could and strapped my pack onto the snowmobile. Within a couple of minutes, I was speeding along the northern trail away from my cabin and in the direction of the decommissioned ranger station. I had killed my friend. He would have killed me if I hadn't acted at first, I know, but that doesn't change anything. I've never used my gun to kill anything, man or beast. It was almost something that was there if I needed it, like a security blanket, but I never really thought I'd have to pull the trigger on anything. Asterisk, no asterisk. I've made a mess of this whole thing. I thought it was all over for me when I skirted a little too close to the edge back in Montana, but fortune had smiled on me, and the powers that be decided to give me another chance. There wouldn't be another pardon for me this time. I'm sitting here in the back room of the old ranger station. I've concealed my snowmobile around back, covered by a tarp and whatever snow I could throw over top. It's starting to snow again outside, so I'm hoping that my tracks will be obscured before too long. Maybe it will buy me some time. Just enough time to get some of this out there to allow me to post some of the truth. I have no delusions about my capabilities. I'm just a caretaker. My training was cursory at best. I'm certainly no match for their teams. My real name is John Wright. I do actually work for the U.S. government, but not for the National Park Service. At least not really. I'm not going to name the organization that I work for. Not because I'm afraid that they'll find out. It's too late for that now. But because the Raptor A protocols will identify and censor this entire post before it has a chance to proliferate. If I do, once the post gets out and starts bouncing around to various servers, it's much more difficult for them to make it go away. My job here is mostly what I've told you. That part's true, but that's mostly just busy work. My cover, if you will, primarily, I'm responsible for keeping an eye out for trespassers who wander a little too close to their facilities or things that have escaped from them, or unintended byproducts of whatever the hell they're doing in there. I don't really know what goes on under the mountain, and I'm sure I wouldn't understand it even if I did. What I do know is that I'm pretty sure those cars that just appear out of nowhere, hundreds of miles from anywhere they have any business being, are from one of those byproducts. The shades. Hell. I don't know. Escapees. Maybe I don't even know what I hope to accomplish by writing all this right now. Maybe it's my way of trying to make it right. Maybe I just want to make sure there's something left of me for anyone to remember. When I posted here 3 years ago, I saw the entrance to the facility. It's about 10 miles from my cabin, right directly into the base of a mountain. I have no idea how big it is inside or how many people are in there, but I know that there were a lot of big military helicopters flying in and out at the beginning of the seasons here. I assume they're transporting researchers or equipment or whatever. It just hit me that if Rick had shown up at my door a half hour earlier, I would have been just finishing my breakfast instead of fully geared up and ready to head out the door for the day. I wouldn't have had my holster strapped to my chest. I'm certain I'd be the one laying in a pool of my own blood right now. Focus, John. Focus. Concentrate. Damn it. I don't have time for this. I don't know what the communication protocol was that Rick was supposed to follow after he took care of me, but I'd assumed someone was waiting for his report to confirm that I'd been silenced. I have to believe that by now, they know something has gone wrong. There's probably a team at my cabin right now. It hasn't been snowing long enough to cover my tracks, unfortunately, which means they'll probably have no trouble figuring out which direction I took. It's only a matter of time before they show up here. Then it's all over. Right now, I'm typing this on my notebook computer and relaying it through the Ranger Station communication network. I'm surprised they haven't locked down the firewalls yet. I fully expected to get cut off from the world once I got here. Small blessings, I guess. At least I can get this out there still. You've probably gathered by now that most of the Rangers around here aren't what they seem either. Some are, I think, but most are ex-military special forces types recruited by the agency to provide security and make sure that the caretakers don't go off the reservation like I did. Rick was that way. His real name is Mike, by the way. I won't tell you his last name. I don't want him remembered as anything other than a hero. I'm the one that messed this whole thing up. He was just doing his job, fulfilling his sworn commitment. He was an honorable man. That's how I want him remembered. My nerves are starting to get the better of me. I just took a look outside because I thought I heard something. I don't think they can get here this quickly, so I'm thinking it was just my imagination. Look, this isn't something isolated to Alaska. They have research facilities all over the U.S. The last one I was at was in Montana, but I know there are others spread across the states. Wyoming, Texas, Kentucky, South Dakota. Hell, they're everywhere. They like to build them in national parks, especially those with huge amounts of wilderness. It ensures a reasonable amount of privacy without drawing the sort of attention to it that places like Groom Lake and Cheyenne Mountain have done. Those two places are basically tourist attractions at this point, but man, once they tried out Alaska, it was like they hit the jackpot. The whole area is so remote and uninhabited that they're virtually guaranteed isolation and secrecy to do whatever it is they're doing in there. Did I tell you about the man I found once, half integrated into a boulder? I don't think so. He was wearing a lab coat, but the only parts of him that were accessible were his right arm and shoulder and the back of his head. The rest of him was somehow inside of it, which was probably for the best. I'm sure he died pretty quickly. I called that one in, and they had a team out there within an hour. I left once they arrived, but when I came back a couple of days later, the whole boulder was gone, and the landscape had been made to look like it had never been there. I'm talking about a rock the size of a small house, just gone. The bear story is true, by the way. The only difference is that it was us who covered the whole thing up. That one scares the hell out of me, because that thing is still roaming out here somewhere. They never were able to find it. Hell, they lost a dozen men just trying. Same story as the bears, by the way. We found the teams down near the runoff gully, just standing there dead. You've never seen a nightmare until you've seen a dozen armed corpses just frozen in place. By the time we found them, they weren't much more than gray skin stretched over tight skeletons, but there they stood, looking like some goddamn zombie army out of a horror movie. I saw it once, I think. The thing that did it was about the size of a tall, thin man, but the shape was all wrong. The joints bent in strange ways, and the head was something that reminded me of a praying mantis. It was covered in black and gray mottled skin that looked sort of like scales, but not quite. I don't know. I'm just a caretaker. I came across it while out making my rounds one day. It was clamped onto the back of one of those big grizzly's arms and legs, wrapped around it like it was some sort of monstrous insect or something. The bear was just standing there, making the most god-awful screams you've ever heard, like it was being burned alive or something, but it wasn't moving. It was just standing there perfectly still while this thing did whatever it was doing. Feeding on the bear somehow, I guess. I hid behind a tree and nearly pissed myself. I thought for sure it was going to hear my panic breathing and come for me next, but it didn't. Eventually, the bear stopped making that terrible crying sound and went quiet. A few minutes later, this thing unwraps itself from around the grizzly, takes a few steps towards a big pine tree, and just vanishes. Only, it didn't really vanish. I nearly stepped out from behind the tree to take a closer look at the bear when I realized it was still looking at that thing. Only its skin had camouflaged itself perfectly into the background, taking on the exact coloring and pattern of the snow-covered pine. I mean, perfectly. The only reason I was able to see it was because a part of it, one of its appendages, I think, was still slightly protruding away from the tree. It was this break in the shape of the tree that caught my attention and probably saved my life. I must have stood there for another hour before it finally took a step away from that tree, its surface returning to the black and gray splashes of color when it moved. It was like a stalking spider, slow and deliberate, graceful and ungainly all at the same time. It was a strange night, is what it was. It took a few steps closer to the bear, like it was trying to figure out whether this was some sort of new prey or whether it was something already used up, like it had forgotten about it and was just looking for its next meal. After that, it glided on down the trail without a sound. Thankfully, in the opposite direction of my hiding spot, I waited another hour before daring to move an inch. When I did, I hauled ass back to my cabin, locked the door, and radioed the whole thing into Mike. They sent a team out but never found anything other than the bear, which they very quickly made disappear. Well, I'm sharing my sins, by the way. The real rangers, the ones that originally found the dead bears and reported it to the NBS, well, you won't find them anymore. There were 3 of them that worked with the researchers, just like I said in my story, but a week after the researchers left, all 3 of those rangers somehow wandered off trail during a snowstorm and died of hypothermia. Yeah, right, hypothermia. You'd think that the agency could at least use a little imagination when they come up with these stories. I know this whole thing took a sudden sharp right turn on you guys, and I'm sorry about that. I'm out of time though. No more time for pretexts or lies. The bottom line is, you're better off staying out of the parks. Go see a movie, go for a drive, play video games, whatever. I suppose even state parks are probably safe enough. But I wouldn't chance it. The things, I've seen what they've done. Okay, I'm pretty sure that wasn't my imagination that time. Time to upload the post. If I'm mistaken, and if I have more time, I'll just send an update. But I want to make sure this gets out there before they stop it. It doesn't like to be noticed. What do you know about Station 21? Asked Len Gibson, the grizzled old forest ranger who was driving me out to my new posting. I shrugged. Not much. I spent most of my time with the Forest Service out west and just transferred to the East Coast recently. This is my first posting out here. He grunted, wrestling with the steering wheel of the old 4-wheel drive pickup as it bucked over the unused trail. Heavy underbrush and thick trees passed by dangerously close on either side. The road was narrow, barely wide enough to accommodate the time-worn truck, and he was driving a bit faster than I was comfortable with. I'm surprised they assigned rangers to it, though. Seems pretty remote, I said. We've been driving for a couple of hours on this trail already, and the lonely stretch of paved road we left earlier was little more than a distant memory at this point. Used to be a fairly popular long hike trail that ran near it, and the department wanted to make sure that we had a presence out here in case anyone got in trouble. He said this without taking his eyes off the path ahead. It was a pretty technical trail. It was pretty common for city folk to underestimate the difficulty or the risk. I frowned briefly. Used to be. It's not in use anymore. Gibson shook his head and spat out the window. Too many people were getting injured on it. A couple of them went missing entirely. The department decided it was too dangerous to maintain it as a sanctioned trail. Let it go to seed stuff. You won't spot it anymore unless you know what you're looking for. You'll find an old rope bridge near the cabin. That's about the only thing that'll let you know it existed at all. Then why maintain a posting here? I asked. He spared a quick glance at me and said, "You know the saying, if there's a station, there's a ranger. They'll probably get around to decommissioning it at some point, but for now." At that moment, we rounded a bend in the trail, and the station came into view. It was built to look like a rustic log cabin, and was planted in the middle of a depressed area of the surrounding forest. The gentle ridges surrounding the area created a natural bowl. The trees here were dense and somehow foreboding, and the unkempt limbs, heavy with gray tendrils of Spanish moss, reached over the cabin and crowded the edges of the modest clearing. The entire area was a lush green, heavily shadowed by the canopy above, and the air was thick with the scents of the deep bush. Gibson used the open clearing to turn the truck around and stopped it in front of the wooden door emblazoned with the Forestry Service logo. Throwing it into park, he turned in his seat and looked at me expectantly. "Not staying a while?" I asked, opening my door and grabbing my overflowing duffel bag from the bed. "Nope," he said, shaking his head. "My job is to transfer rangers and know their postings around here. Used to be that each ranger would have their own assigned vehicle, but the budget doesn't support that anymore." I stepped back from the truck and shut the door, throwing the duffel over my shoulder. "Where's the guy I'm leaving?" I asked, looking around. "That's Ed Marsh. Brought him out here a month ago, same as I brought you a week ago. The guy that does the supply runs came out here and found the station empty." He said something unspoken behind his light gray eyes. "So what, he just disappeared?" I asked, disbelievingly. The old ranger scratched a moment at the 3-day growth of white stubble on his cheek, as if trying to figure out how to phrase his answer. "Look, Miller, you seem like a nice guy. There aren't too many things in this area that'll threaten a man, aside from maybe a copperhead or the odd black bear, but neither of them are too common here. The truth is, some men just aren't built for the solitude and isolation up here. Ed Marsh seems solid enough, but he wouldn't be the first ranger to just up and leave his posting at Station 21. I took another glance around the area before turning back to Gibson, patting the bulging canvas slung over my shoulder. "Well, I got plenty of books to occupy my time. I brought my camera, so I expect I'll be able to add some really good shots to my portfolio." He paused a moment before ducking his head in an amiable nod and barking a laugh. "That's good, kid. Keep yourself busy, and the month will fly by before you know it. Elliot Barnes will be out here in a week to resupply you, but you should have plenty still in the cabin to carry you over." I nodded my thanks to him and stepped back from the pickup as he threw it into gear and headed back the way we'd come. I watched the tan and maroon 4x4 until it was lost to view, the sounds of its whining engine fading among the trees. I found myself alone in front of the cabin, glad to be on solid ground. After the morning's less than smooth ride out here, the sounds of nature, which had momentarily been muted when we arrived, slowly returned in force. The chittering of squirrels and chipmunks somehow harmonized with the bird song in the treetops. The air was cool and still as I stepped onto the wooden porch that spanned the front of the cabin. I turned the knob and pushed the door inward. The interior of the station was Spartan and neat, divided into a small office space for visitors and a slightly larger living space for the ranger. I walked around the low wooden counter and through the open doorway that led to my new accommodations for the next month. It was relatively neat and organized. The ranger who'd been posted here before me looked to have been fairly settled into his posting. I wondered briefly why a forest ranger accustomed to spending his time alone in the forest would decide one day to just pick up and leave. The trail back to the main road wasn't a difficult one to hike, but it was a long one. Of course, Ed Marsh had probably called a friend to come out and pick him up, but it still didn't make any sense. Regardless, it was a mystery for another day. The sun was beginning to set, and I still needed to get settled in and set up for the night. By the time I had unpacked my stuff and started a fire in the cobblestone fireplace, night had fallen. The silence of the woodlands around me was a familiar comfort, different from my previous post in the Pacific Northwest, yet somehow the same. The air began to chill with the coming of night, and I made my way around the cabin, locking the front door to prevent any curious critters from finding their way inside during the night. I left the windows open a bit for airflow and settled comfortably in a cushioned chair in front of the crackling flames with a bit of Johnny Walker I'd carefully packed. I was just enjoying the moment, lost in my thoughts. My eyes wandered aimlessly around the room, taking in my new surroundings. I stopped when they settled upon some crumpled pieces of paper that had been discarded and were hiding in the corner of the room near the bed. With a grunt of interest, I stood from the chair and took another swallow of the scotch, heading over and snatching the papers up from the floor. Returning to my seat in front of the fireplace, I set the glass on the low-end table to my right and smoothed the papers out on my knee. They looked like they had been torn out of a bound notebook, perhaps a composition book or journal, and the handwriting was in a sloppy cursive written in black ink. I raised my eyebrows in interest as I read the first page. Dropped off today by Ranger Gibson. Thought I was going to piss myself for the last half hour of the drive. I think he had every rock and route on that trail. The old bastard tried to spook me with the history of Station 21. But I'm not a rookie. I know how things are for new postings. I have to admit that Station 21 is a bit of a mystery, but it just adds to the charm of the place. I'll have plenty of time to get familiar with it. I flipped to the next page. Some sort of animal was outside the cabin last night. I'm glad I thought to close the door. The last thing I want is to wake up to a black bear rooting around in my provisions. Am into that. Another page. I swear to Christ, if that old bastard is trying to scare me, I'm going to beat his ass. I don't have any interest in playing any Dan games, and even less interest in going out in the middle of the night in the rain. I didn't think that Gibson seemed like the type of person to haze a new guy, but what did I know? I turned to the next page and kept reading. Okay, I'm not sure what the hell that was outside last night, but I don't think it was Gibson. There are no tire tracks anywhere nearby, and I can't find any boot prints in the mud this morning. Whatever it was too big to be a raccoon. Maybe a black bear. I guess I need to be sure to keep things locked up. I'm starting to wish they issued rifles out here. The last page was the strangest of the bunch. I think I saw it today out by the ravine, but I think it saw me too. I don't think it likes it when you notice it because it sure took notice of me pretty damn quick after I spotted it. Need to be more careful. I reread the pages a few more times, pouring myself a bit more of a scotch and reclining back in the chair as I pondered what I had read. I must have drifted off at some point because I awoke to the sound of rain and thunder. The fire had died down to embers, and a chill had replaced the comfortable warmth that had provided. I stood from my chair and walked over to the window, looking out into the dark at the rain. Even with the heavy cloud cover, I could still make out the dim shapes of the trees beyond the clearing in front of the cabin. A gust of wind rose and blew the missing rain into my face through the screen. Not wanting to have to spend the next morning trying to dry everything out, I began walking around all the windows and closing them, lamenting the loss of fresh air they permitted into the cabin's interior. I moved to the last window, the one nearest the main entrance to the ranger station, and froze. My brow creased, and I squinted into the rainy darkness. I was sure I had seen a shape moving along the tree line, but lost it when the storm intensified briefly and obscured my view. Staring into the darkness for a long minute, I reluctantly backed away and closed the last window, shaking off the uncomfortable feeling as best I could before moving over to the bed and dropping into it without bothering to undress. Sleep quickly took me, and my dreams were filled with strange and unseen shapes hiding in the shadows at the edge of my awareness. By the time I rolled out of bed the next morning, all remnants of the previous night's unease had vanished, and my mood was heightened as I faced my first morning at my new post. After a quick breakfast and a change into a fresh uniform, I threw open all the windows before stepping out of the cabin and into the damp early morning air. I dug my camera out of its case and threw a strap over my head as I set out. The first thing I wanted to do was to take a look around the area, get a sense of my surroundings. Gibson had told me there was an old rope bridge that led to the decommissioned trail nearby, and after a quick look at the area map in the ranger's office, I figured that it was only a 100 yards or so north of the station. I figured that would be as good a place as any to start and would probably provide some nice opportunities to get some dynamic shots. My narrow trail led into the tree line to my right. As I stepped off the wooden porch and into the ankle-high grass of the clearing, a small sign with a white arrow was posted near the trail with a brief description: Grom's Ravine. With a spring in my step, I followed the narrow trail through the trees, embracing the sense of nature that surrounded me. The constant dripping of the previous night's rainwater joined its voice to the native fauna and seemed to push me along. Before long, I emerged from the trail and found myself standing at the edge of a jagged cliff. The grassy ground abruptly gave way to a rocky vertical face that tumbled down nearly 100 feet to the floor of the ravine below. The base of the gulch was filled with the angry flow of a narrow river, though I suspected that it was likely the storm from the night before that made it so. It was probably ordinarily a little more than a meandering creek when the weather was dry. Spanning the ravine was an old and weather-worn rope suspension bridge with gap-toothed wooden planks, beckoning for travelers to cross. They didn't look too trustworthy, so I decided to keep my feet on solid ground for today. Perhaps I'd be a little braver another day and try my luck with the bridge instead. I raised my camera and removed the lens cap, bringing it up to my eye and taking several pictures of the scene, including a point-of-view shot looking across the bridge itself, as if the viewer were ready to step onto the span. I was pleased with that one. I felt it added a little drama to the rest. After a while, I replaced the lens cap and continued my exploration of the area surrounding the ranger station, eventually finding myself back at the cabin in the waning afternoon light. All in all, it had been a peaceful and pleasant day, and I'd wrap it up with some light chores around the station before calling it a day. That evening, I copied the images from my earlier outing to my tablet and was lazily swiping through them as I picked at my dinner. I reached the set I had taken at the rope bridge and smiled at them. They turned out better than I'd hoped. As expected, the POV shot across the span was the best of them. I wish I had thought to add a little more field of view for added drama, but I could take care of that with editing. I didn't think that would be necessary, though. I was sure I'd end up with hundreds of similar shots by the time I rotated out of this posting. Something in one of the shots of the bridge caught my eye, and I set my plate aside as I zoomed in closer on the image. In the foliage across the ravine, half hidden behind a tree, was what looked like a tall, impossibly thin man. He appeared to be leaning around the tree and staring directly at me, thinking it must just be a trick of the light as it played upon the undergrowth. I checked the other pictures and gasped out loud, startled at what I saw in each of the images taken at the ravine. The figure appeared in the first view. It seemed to be moving slowly among the trees, oblivious to my presence. But then suddenly, in the next frame, there it was, standing behind the tree and staring directly at my camera at me. The man was tall. He must have been well over 6 feet and very thin. He appeared to be dressed head to toe in some sort of black cloak or cape, and only his pale, bald head and hands were otherwise visible. Most unsettling, however, were his eyes, which were unusually large and dark, like fist-sized black marbles set into his pale face. I couldn't really make out much more detail than that. He hadn't been the focus of my shot, and there was no way to enhance that area of the image any further. My attempts to zoom in more only succeeded in pixelating the image and obscuring the man. At first, I was more than a little shaken, but then I thought about it more and chided myself for being so easily startled. Sure, the encounter was an unusual one, but Gibson had told me the trail that lay beyond the ravine had been a popular one. Just because the Forestry Service had decided to stop maintaining it didn't mean that adventurous hikers didn't still travel it. That would also explain why the department wanted to maintain a ranger presence out here. If the trail was still being used, even unofficially, they would still want a ranger nearby in case of trouble. It all fit together nicely, and my nerves eased again. Still, a small glass of Johnny Walker was always welcome. So I started a fire and settled in for the night. During the light cleaning I had done that afternoon, I'd found another couple of crumpled pages behind the wastebasket and had set them aside on the end table to review later. Now, as I sat again before the crackling flames, I examined the 2 additional pages and felt the chill of dread climb from the base of my spine as I read the increasingly chaotic script. Something was outside the cabin again last night. It wasn't just hiding in the trees anymore. I feel like it's seen me, like it's taking notice of me now. I know how crazy that sounds, but it's the only way I can explain it. Elliot Barnes will be out here in 2 days to resupply me, and I'll leave with him when he gets here. They can find someone else to sit out here in this deserted ranger station. There's no need for any of us to be out here, and I don't think we belong here. I don't think it likes people being here. I don't think it likes to be noticed. I straightened from the hunched position I had unconsciously taken while examining the pages, stretching out the knot that had formed in the muscles of my neck as I stood and glanced over at the darkening windows that ringed the cabin walls. During the day, they provided welcome light and plenty of ventilation to the interior. But now at night, they made me feel vulnerable. Anything could be outside, looking in at me through any of these windows, and I wouldn't know it. I could be surrounded by watchers on all sides and never have a clue. Get yourself together, for Christ's sake, I said aloud, shaking myself back to my senses. This was stupid. I had been in areas more remote and dangerous than this before. This was a posting they gave to rookies, simple and safe, difficult to get into, too much trouble here. That being said, I didn't hesitate to ensure the front door was locked and secured, and figured tonight I could sleep without the windows being open. Things would look a lot different in the morning. I was starting to agree with my predecessor. A rifle would have gone a long way to setting my mind at ease. Right about then, the rain came again that night, with less fury but greater volume. I tossed and turned in my sleep, never finding a comfortable position. In fact, it was less the mattress and more my imagination keeping sleep at bay. I couldn't coax my mind to quiet and calm itself in the darkness. It insisted on constructing sinister images to keep me awake. When I opened my eyes, it continued making the shapes of the furniture around me into alien and menacing forms. I turned over onto my side with frustration, forcing my eyes closed and focusing on the hissing sound of the rain on the metal roof above me. Normally, it would provide the perfect environment to lull me into a deep and restful sleep, but now it would only serve to mask the sounds of anything that might be sneaking around outside the cabin. Stop it, I told myself angrily, opening my eyes, and I froze as my gaze fell upon the grotesque pale face at the nearest window, staring in at me with some detached and inhuman curiosity. The black eyes were huge and unmoving, even as I watched rivulets of rainwater stream down its face and over them. I could see small tremors of the white skin of its face, as it almost seemed to tremble minutely, as if it didn't have full control of its body involuntarily. I abruptly sat upright in my bed in shock, and without changing its blank expression, The face somehow seemed to grow agitated, heated. I don't think it likes to be noticed. Those words from Ed Marsh's pages floated into my mind, and I thought he might be right. In an instant, it had faded away from the window, leaving only blackness in its wake. Was it gone? Was it moving to another window? Was it waiting for me? It wasn't an animal. That much I could tell. If it was a man, I need to understand what he wanted. If it wasn't a man, I need to understand what it was. I couldn't stay here for another month with this thing haunting me every day and night, always wondering if and when it would come for me. What if I hadn't awoken when I had? Would it have grown bolder and come inside? I'm going out there. I don't have any weapons other than this can of bear spray. But I have to know. I can't just stay here and wait for it. I can't wait for it to wear me down from exhaustion and lack of sleep. If I'm going to confront it, it needs to be now. I wanted to write this all down before I went out there, just in case. I don't know what's going to happen or what's out there, but I need to know. Hopefully, I'll have more information to update this journal in a while. Wish me luck. The preceding pages were discovered in a journal left by the forest ranger I was sent here to relieve. I can't find any trace of him other than his camera and some other personal effects, and the ranger that dropped me off said he just went missing one day. From what he was telling me, that's not exactly an unheard of occurrence at the station. Some people just can't handle the isolation. Reading his journal, it sounds like he was more than a little unhinged and experiencing hallucinations. I've long thought that the Forestry Service needed to institute psychological evaluations before they just send people out into the wilderness in complete solitude. One thing that I can agree with my predecessor on, however, is that I need to keep the door locked at night. It sounded like something pretty big was moving around outside in the rain last night. I'm going to set some trail cameras tomorrow, I think, but if I hear it outside again tonight, I'll need to check it. Yosemite Park Ranger Cave. The job of a Yosemite Park Ranger isn't what most people imagine. A lot of people picture us as law enforcement types, handing out tickets and enforcing park rules, when really, that's a very niche aspect of it. Mostly, we're just here to assist you, handing out maps, not speeding tickets, and giving people directions to the best views or to ideal camping spots. We remind people about safety and weather conditions from day to day, but the main thing we do, and this is more vital than people realize, is that we're just here in case anyone gets lost or hurt. We deal with a lot of belligerent people who like to think the park is their personal playground where they can do whatever they want. It's my job to remind them to follow the rules, to dispose of their trash properly, to pick up after their dog, and to clip its leash back on while walking the trails. Some people take this as a personal assault on their freedoms when really, I'm just looking out for the safety of the other visitors, like cyclists and horseback riders who share the paths. Dogs can be unpredictable and can misbehave on trails, and we have to look out for everyone, not just them. Still, I don't get a lot of positive feedback for enforcing these rules. Nobody likes to be told what to do. Trust me, I get it. Every once in a while, though, something interesting happens to break up the boredom and monotony of the job. Last summer, I was walking around at night doing a patrol of the campgrounds when I saw something rustling around in the bush. A guy came crawling out, dressed in a furry dog costume. I asked him if he was okay, and he just barked at me and crawled away in the opposite direction. A little while after that, I saw him chasing another person on all fours who was dressed as a Catwoman. She went scampering away and hid beneath a camper van, laughing excitedly and making purring sounds. Looking at the dirt from her fur pants with a long tongue, she saw me watching and clawed the air in front of her face, hissing territorial. It's not how I would choose to spend my Friday nights, but I'm not one to judge. By far, the most interesting thing that has ever happened to me at Yosemite occurred last summer. It wasn't just interesting, it was utterly terrifying. Every night when I fall asleep, I have nightmares about that day. Every time I close my eyes, I picture those dark tunnels in the rock face. It all started when someone called in a report saying they were on the Cathedral Lake Trail when their brother went missing. The pair had been out hiking and got separated somehow. At first, I thought it was just a routine mishap. People go missing all the time. It's no big deal in most cases, since usually the in-parties are found quickly enough. More than half the time, alcohol is involved, and I have to remind people to pace themselves if they want to indulge while camping or hiking. But every once in a while, those missing people don't turn up. We have to dispatch much larger search parties. In this case, I went out on my own first, heading to where the man had called us from. I drove it in an ATV since it was a 16-mile round trip. When I got there, the guy looked frantic. He ran over to me and started speaking way too fast to understand. I told him to slow down and just give me the facts. It's important to stay calm in these types of situations. The guy took a deep breath and let it out, and he started talking again a little bit slower. This time, we were walking on the trail. He was right beside me. And then I turned to look at the lake, and when I looked back, he's just gone. Just gone. I tried to get a sense if the man had been drinking or doing drugs. It's not that I'm trying to assume the worst in people, but we have to think of these types of things. The simplest explanation is usually the right one after all. And it was much easier to imagine the two brothers taking sips of a Mickey and one of them getting separated and lost than to imagine one of them being abducted by aliens or taken in a very selective rapture. All right, slow down for a second. Take some deep breaths. What's your name? I said. Greg, he said, his face turning a shade less purple as he began to inhale air with trembling breaths in and out. Okay, Greg. I took out my notepad, jotting this down along with his last name, which I'll leave out for the sake of privacy. What's your brother's name? Dave, he said, sniffling. I saw he'd been crying recently. And where was the last place you saw your brother? Let's retrace your steps. He started protesting, saying that wasn't going to help, but I convinced him we had to at least try. Greg led me back a little ways to where he'd seen his brother last. I walked back here already and I looked around all around here before calling you guys. I thought maybe he went off the trail to take a leak and tripped, hit his head. Something like that. I don't know. I was grasping at straws. But I think something. He hesitated. Something. What do you think? Something. Something took. He looked embarrassed, but I tried to get more out of him and asked, which stories are you talking about? You know, you hear those stories about Yosemite and other national parks. I'm sure you heard about them, even if you're not in on a conspiracy. Stories where people go missing like this, and it makes no sense. Someone turns their back for a second, and their son or their sister, or whoever is just gone, disappeared like. Dave, I saw it on YouTube, I replied, not sure what corner of the internet this guy had been visiting. Well, that doesn't happen around here, he said. Okay, I can assure you, let's just keep looking. I'm sure he'll turn up, but the longer we look, the less we find. It really did seem like the man's brother had just vanished. I was about to call in for more support, maybe even a canine unit, when the man yelled from a little ways off the trail saying he'd found something, following the sound of his voice. I eventually came to find him at the base of the mountain face to face with the granite wall. First, I didn't understand what he was doing there so far in the forest, but as I got closer, I saw there was actually a cave which was well hidden in the rock face. It blended in perfectly with the mountainside until you were almost nose to nose with the pale gray stone. Good job, I said, patting him on the shoulder. But then I looked around at our surroundings, getting nervous. We were far from the path in the thick part of the forest, which was overgrown and tangled with vines and shrubbery. Do you think he would have gone into this cave on his own? Greg looked around as if checking to see if his brother had left a message for him. There was nothing. I don't think so. It's not like him to just leave me on the trail alone, especially not for this long. If this was a prank or something, he'd have come back by now. I can just tell something's not right. Has your brother played pranks on you like this before? I asked the man. He was in his 20s, and his brother was probably of a similar age. Young men occasionally got lost or injured trying to scare each other by pulling pranks or filming videos in the woods. It was rare, but it had happened before, once or twice. I didn't call you guys for a while because I thought he was messing with me. I wouldn't put it past him, but not for this long. I was getting annoyed. You probably annoyed me even more because I have my own older brother back home who played tricks on me in my younger days, and this was bringing back bad memories. All right, you can come out of there right now, I yelled, marching into the cave, thinking the young man would be hiding in the small alcove and I'd give him a piece of my mind. I turned a corner and saw the horror unfolding within the guts of Cathedral Peak. I can't possibly explain what I saw down there. The shadows obscured most of it, drenching the monstrous creature in darkness. The impression I got was of something like an octopus or a squid crossbreed with some oversized plant or dark fungus of some sort, sucking and slurping, chewing and crunching something between its teeth. After a few moments of inspection, I realized it was a person's face that was being eaten. The details could just barely be seen in the dim light of the cave. The skin was being stripped from its cheeks, the eyelids ripped off, the lips peeled back and slurped up like noodles. Tentacles, like tangled vines, were everywhere, slithering and sliding across the pale gray stone floor all around me. First, I thought it was mud beneath my feet, but as I came fully to my senses, I realized it was blood mingling and mixing with the dust beneath my feet, creating a dark, toxic red slurry that sucked at my boot heels. There were tentacle vine things everywhere. I realized with numb shock my feet were actually stepping on some of them, and I was amazed the creature hadn't noticed me yet, if it was a part of them. But it's obviously cut up with whatever meal it was currently ingesting. Feeling very glad I hadn't turned on my flashlight, I began to back away very slowly, my boots crunching across the right ring tentacles. A sick knot in my stomach was rising up and threatening to make me puke, fear and revulsion twisting my gut. My mind was spinning and my thoughts were racing. Understanding there was a very good chance I would never leave this place, I tried desperately not to step on any more of the squirming writhing tentacles, which moved and twisted on the floor of the cave, soaking and basking in the blood that was spilled everywhere like pigs rolling happily in the mud. There's no possible way there could be so much of it. I thought no one person has this much blood inside of them. This is like a flowing river. And then I saw the others. They were hanging suspended from the ceiling, from the walls, from everywhere amidst the purple vine tentacles. They breathed in and out, still being kept alive, but just barely. Dozens of them were strung up and down the length of the cave, their chests rising and falling with weak breaths, but none of them opening their eyes or speaking. It was like they were sleeping. After a few long moments of searching, I found him. Greg, the hiker from the trail who was looking for his brother. He was hanging upside down from the wall just beside me, his eyes closed, parts of him missing. A piece of his cheek, part of his hand. The wounds were slowly healing. The creature, whatever it was, kept its victims alive down there. I realized it was ingesting them slowly, perhaps even using other pieces of its victims as nutrients to feed the ones who were dying of starvation, like another worldly pyramid scheme built of blood and human remains. Shaking that mental image away, I grabbed Greg's shoulder, hoping to wake him up quietly. His eyes shot open a second after I touched him, revealing only the whites, and he began to screech. And I don't mean screeching like he was screaming out of fear or pain or anything like that. This was an inhuman alarm cry, which signified to me immediately that there was no shred of humanity left in him. He was now a part of the hive mind of this creature and its tentacle army. As his head turned on a swivel, I saw smaller tentacles wrapped around him, going into his brain and into his neck, invading his ears and eyes, drilling into his spinal column as well. I screamed involuntarily, seeing these details and hearing the creature in the tunnel as I recognized my presence. It wasn't fast, whatever it was, but it was huge, and I was in its home. The cave shook around me, dust and pebbles falling from the stone ceiling as I backed away from the hiker, and he continued to screech beneath my feet. The vines were suddenly moving quickly, sliding around so I couldn't find any balance, whipping back and forth. Soon, as my shoes found purchase on the stone floor beneath me, I began to run. The tunnel was alive all around me now, the vines twisting and bending towards me, reaching out like greedy hands trying to grab me as I raced past. Looking over my shoulder, I saw the amorphous creature's central girth finding its way through the cave and moving my way a lot faster now than I would have thought possible. But then, again, I wouldn't have thought any of this was possible before living. The light of the entryway was just up ahead, and I could smell the fresh air. I could see the sun, and then my feet suddenly slipped as if someone had pulled a rug out from under me, and I went crashing to the ground face first. My jaw closed hard, and I bit my tongue, causing it to bleed, the taste of copper filling my mouth. A second later, I tried to get to my feet. The mental image of those poor trapped people could be seen clearly in my mind's eye. Thinking back, I think the creature, whatever it was, needed us to be unsuspecting. If we were aware of what it was doing, its hypnosis wouldn't work. Maybe it was like a chemical it released to cause people to want to explore the cave, like a pheromone that insects use to communicate, only geared towards people. But it didn't work well if you knew about it, and if you understood what the creature's purpose was. Still, it released some more of that pheromone or whatever chemical it was using to lure people in. And I actually felt my legs grow a little heavier, my eyelids too. There's a powerful urge to rest now, and it felt like I had suddenly just worked 3 night shifts and really needed to sleep. But then, the wave of hypnosis passed, and I felt the rumbling of the ground beneath me, and that broke me from my trance again. I scrambled to my feet, sprinting toward the cave entrance, and leaving my backpack far behind in an effort to lighten the load. I saw the rocks were actually closing in, narrowing the gap. The entryway was shrinking somehow. It was the vines. I realized that they were what was camouflaging the entrance, their color changing to match the pale gray stone. I picked up my pace, the twisting forms beneath me making it even more difficult. I didn't dare risk a glance over my shoulder, feeling the rumbling of the floor and knowing that the bulk of the creature was just behind me, closing in with the gap of the exit narrowing even further, shrinking to the size of a dartboard. I dove headfirst into it, imagining my face slamming into a sheer rock wall as it suddenly turned to stone right in front of me, sealing me into this dark labyrinth of suffering forever with the rest of these tortured souls. My eyes were squinted tightly shut as I felt the vines pulling and tearing at me as I went through the gap. For an instant, they squeezed in around my midsection, threatening to stop me like Winnie the Pooh after an unfortunate attempt at pilfering honey. But I popped out of the hole and sealed up behind me. In an instant, I heard a loud crash as the creature flew headlong into its own obstruction. The trap it had created for me to keep me there, it hindered its own escape, preventing it from chasing after me. I could hear it thrashing and clawing at the vines, desperate for more flesh to sustain itself. Whatever it was growing too large even for its own control. Left alone to feed in the heart of the mountain, the creature would eventually destroy itself. It would consume its own flesh to sate its monstrous hunger, like a snake eating its own tail. I had a very strong suspicion it was true. With that very specific idea in mind, I wandered back to my car. It was easier now without the backpack and all the gear, but to walk back out to the cave would be harder. There would be lots to carry. Next time, after a trip to the hardware store, I went back out to the trail. It was nighttime now, and the place was abandoned. I borrowed one of the Ranger ATVs and took my supplies out to the spot where the cave had been. After bringing a few buckets of water from the lake, I began my work. Since I'd marked the cave, it was easy to find again, and I began laying down the fast-drying cement on the mountainside. As park rangers, our job is actually to stop people from vandalizing mountains in this way, but I got the feeling Mother Nature would forgive me. It was my job to protect this place after all, to protect the people who visited here. And nothing could protect people from this thing. It was best to seal it away forever and let it slowly consume itself. Without a fresh supply of hikers, it would eventually run out of calories. It would eventually expire. It was only a matter of time. The vine tentacles squirmed beneath the layer of cement, groggy, reaching out for me, trying to pull me in. I grabbed the trowel and slopped another thick coating of cement on top of them, and watched as it rapidly began to dry. The tentacles began to smooth out and settle back down again, falling asleep, looking very much like the rock face of the mountain again. The inhuman shriek could be heard from inside again, much louder this time, as if all the hikers who the creature had abducted had all woken up at the same instant, and for just a second, realized their predicament. "Sorry, Greg," I muttered to myself alone in the dark forest. "I told you not to go in."